The stone floor was cold enough to burn. Reina's knees scraped against it as she crawled, hands trembling, breath coming in shallow gasps that tasted like copper and fear. Blood smeared beneath her palms, not hers, not yet, but the castle had a way of marking everyone who touched it. The Alpha King's fortress didn't forgive. It didn't forget. And tonight, it was hunting. She pressed herself against the corridor wall, fingers digging into the ancient mortar between stones that had stood for 300 years. 300 years of secrets. 300 years of lies. The torches along the passageway flickered as though something unseen had just passed through them, and Reina's heartbeat hammered so loud she was certain every wolf in the fortress could hear it. They probably could. Wolves heard everything, smelled everything, knew everything, except what she really was. The corridor stretched ahead of her like a throat waiting to swallow her whole. Shadows pooled in doorways. Moonlight sliced through narrow windows in pale silver ribbons that looked too much like blades. Somewhere above, boots struck stone in a rhythm that made her stomach clench. Patrol. They were always patrolling. Always watching. The Alpha King's guards moved through these halls like ghosts with teeth, and Reina had learned long ago how to become invisible among them. But tonight, invisibility wasn't enough. She forced herself to stand, legs shaking beneath the rough cotton of her maid's uniform. Gray fabric. Shapeless. Designed to erase identity, to turn a person into nothing more than hands that scrubbed and feet that scurried. The other servants wore theirs with resignation. Reina wore hers like armor. Like a disguise that had kept her alive for 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not that she was counting. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows with a fury that matched the storm building in her chest. Rain hammered against stone, and thunder rolled across the mountains like the growl of something ancient and hungry. The weather always turned violent on nights like this. Nights when the moon hung full and swollen in the sky, calling to every wolf-blooded creature within 100 miles. Nights when her power stirred beneath her skin like a second heartbeat, demanding to be acknowledged. Demanding to be free. Reina bit down on her lower lip until she tasted blood. Control. She needed control. Her fingers found the worn leather cord around her neck, hidden beneath the collar of her uniform, and she clutched the small pendant that hung there, a circle of black and silver etched with symbols no one living should recognize. The metal was warm against her palm, warmer than it should be, and for just a moment she felt the whisper of something vast and ancient pressing against the edges of her consciousness. Not now. Not here. She released the pendant and forced herself to move. The servants' corridor was narrow, designed for people who didn't matter, and it twisted through the fortress like a vein carrying blood through a dying body. Reina knew every turn, every alcove, every loose stone that could betray a footstep. She'd memorized them all during those first terrifying weeks, when she'd arrived at the fortress with nothing but a forged reference letter and a prayer that no one would look too closely. No one had. Servants were invisible, especially the quiet ones. She reached the end of the corridor where it split into 2 passages, one leading toward the kitchens, the other descending into the lower levels where storage rooms and wine cellars stretched into darkness. She chose the descent. Always down. Always deeper into the places where nobles never ventured and guards rarely bothered to patrol. The air grew colder as she descended, thick with the smell of damp stone and old earth. The stairs were worn smooth by centuries of feet, and Reina's own steps made no sound. She'd learned how to walk like a ghost, how to breathe like a shadow. Survival demanded it. Discovery meant death. They'd told her as much the night they'd brought her here. The memory surfaced before she could stop it, rough hands shoving her through a doorway, the cold voice of the elder who'd sold her into servitude explaining the terms of her curse with all the warmth of a winter grave. You will serve the Alpha King's household until the debt of your bloodline is paid. You will never speak of who you are or where you came from. You will hide your scent, suppress your power, and remember that the moment you are discovered, The moment anyone learns the truth, you will be executed before dawn. The Alpha Kings do not show mercy to the children of traitors. Children of traitors. That's what they called her people now. The ones who'd survived, at least. Most hadn't. Most had burned when the fortress had been set ablaze 23 years ago, their screams swallowed by flames and smoke, and the howling of wolves drunk on bloodlust. Reina had been too young to remember it. But she'd heard the stories. She'd seen the scars on the faces of the few who'd escaped. She'd learned the names of the dead and carried them like stones in her chest. And she'd learned to hate. The hatred was a living thing inside her, cold and patient and permanent. It wrapped around her ribs and squeezed every time she scrubbed blood from the great hall floors or served wine to nobles who laughed about the old wars. It whispered to her when she passed the throne room where the Alpha King held court, his voice a low rumble that made the very air vibrate with dominance. It burned when she caught sight of the banners hanging from the walls, crimson and gold, the colors of the pack that had destroyed everything she should have been. But hatred wasn't enough. Hatred couldn't break a curse. And until she found a way to undo the binding that chained her to this place, she was trapped. A prisoner playing the role of a servant. A wolf forced to bow her head to the very pack that had slaughtered her own. Reina reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. The corridor here was barely wide enough for one person, and the darkness was thick enough to taste. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a small cloth bundle, unwrapping it carefully to reveal 3 items: a stub of candle, a book of matches, and a small iron key that had taken her 6 months to steal. The key to the east postern gate. The gate that opened onto the wildlands beyond the fortress walls. Her hands shook as she struck a match and lit the candle. The flame guttered and danced, casting wild shadows that seemed to reach for her. She held it steady and began to walk. The corridor branched again, then again, becoming a maze that would have confused anyone who didn't know the pattern. But Reina had spent 2 years mapping these forgotten passages. 2 years preparing for this moment. Tonight, she was leaving. Not forever. She couldn't leave forever, not while the curse held her. But for a few hours, she could slip away. She could reach the place that called to her every full moon, the place where the ruins of her people's temple still stood in defiance of time and fire and vengeance. She could kneel before the lunar altar and remember what she was beneath the gray uniform and bowed head. She could remember that she was more than a maid. The passage opened into a small storage room lined with dusty crates and barrels. Reina moved quickly, navigating between them until she reached the far wall where a section of stone sat just slightly off-center. She pressed her palm against it and pushed. The stone swung inward on hinges that hadn't been used in decades, revealing a narrow tunnel beyond. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and pine and freedom. Reina stepped through and pulled the stone closed behind her. The tunnel was rough-hewn and low, forcing her to crouch as she moved. Her candle flickered in the draft, threatening to go out, but she cupped her hand around the flame and kept moving. The sound of rain grew louder. The smell of the forest intensified. And beneath it all, she felt the pull, that inexorable tug toward the place that sang to her blood. The tunnel ended in a grate covered with moss and old vines. Reina set the candle down and used the iron key on the rusted lock. It took 3 tries and all her strength, but finally the lock gave way with a groan that made her freeze, listening for any sound of pursuit. Nothing. Only rain and wind and the distant rumble of thunder. She pushed the grate open and crawled out into the night. The storm hit her like a fist. Rain soaked through her uniform in seconds, plastering the fabric to her skin and turning her hair into a dark curtain that clung to her face and neck. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in stark white flashes that revealed twisted trees and jagged rocks and the narrow path that led away from the fortress. Reina didn't hesitate. She ran. Her feet slipped on wet earth and moss-covered stones, but she didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. The forest closed around her like a protective hand, branches reaching overhead to form a canopy that blocked some of the rain but trapped the darkness beneath. She knew this path. She'd walked it in her dreams for 2 years. Walked it and run it and crawled it when the longing became too much to bear. The temple was 3 miles from the fortress. 3 miles through forbidden lands where no wolf from the Alpha King's pack dared to venture. They said the forest was cursed. They said spirits of the dead wandered beneath the trees, hungry and vengeful. They said anyone who entered never came back whole. They were right. The forest was cursed. But not by the dead. By her. Reina felt the shift beginning before she reached the first marker stone. Her skin prickled with heat despite the cold rain, and the pendant around her neck began to burn like a live coal pressed against her sternum. Power unfurled inside her chest, stretching and testing the boundaries she'd held it behind for so long. Too long. She'd kept it locked down, suppressed, hidden beneath layers of mundane humanity until she could barely remember what it felt like to let it breathe. But here, away from the fortress and the watching eyes and the curse that bound her tongue, she could release it. Just a little. Just enough to remember. Just enough to survive. The marker stone loomed out of the darkness, a pillar of white granite carved with runes that predated the Alpha King's reign by 1,000 years. Reina pressed her hand against it as she passed, and the stone warmed beneath her touch, humming with recognition. The runes flared silver for just an instant, then faded back to cold stone. 2 more marker stones. 2 more miles. Her breath came in ragged gasps now, and her legs burned with exhaustion. But beneath the physical strain, she felt something else rising. Joy. Fierce and wild and terrible. The joy of a caged bird finally glimpsing open sky. The second marker stone appeared through the trees, and then the third, and then the ruins. They rose out of the forest like broken teeth, crumbling walls and shattered columns that had once supported a roof open to the moon. The temple had been magnificent once, a place where her people had gathered to worship and dance and offer prayers to the goddess who watched over all wolves. Now it was a graveyard of stone and memory, overgrown with vines and moss and the slow, patient decay of time. But the altar still stood. Reina stumbled into the clearing and fell to her knees before it. The altar was a raised platform of black stone, smooth and unmarked except for the single symbol carved into its center, a crescent moon embracing a star. Her fingers found the carving, traced its familiar lines, and something inside her chest cracked open like an egg. Power poured out. Not the careful trickle she allowed herself in the fortress, but a flood that lit up every nerve and bone and cell in her body. Her eyes burned silver white. Her skin began to glow with the same light, pushing back the darkness and the rain until she knelt at the center of a sphere of luminescence that made the ruins look almost whole again. And she began to speak. The words came in a language that had been dead for generations, syllables that tasted like starlight and smoke. They spilled from her lips in a torrent, part prayer and part invocation and part raw desperate plea. She didn't know if the goddess could hear her. Didn't know if anyone could. But she spoke anyway, because the alternative was silence, and silence would kill her long before the Alpha King's executioner ever had the chance. The rain stopped falling within the circle of her light. The wind died. And for just a moment, the world held its breath. Reina lifted her face to the sky, eyes still blazing, and felt the full weight of the moon's attention settle on her like a physical touch. Power surged through her veins, answering the lunar call with a resonance that made her gasp. This was who she was beneath the uniform and the bowed head. This was the truth she hid from every waking moment. She was Reina, last daughter of the Silver Moon line, heir to a bloodline the Alpha Kings had sworn to erase from history. She was the girl they should have killed. The mistake they'd let slip through their fingers. She was the storm they didn't know was coming. The light around her pulsed once, twice, then faded, leaving her kneeling in the rain-soaked darkness with her heart hammering and her hands shaking. The power retreated, sliding back beneath her skin like a serpent returning to its den. but it left warmth in its wake. Strength. The reminder that she was not as helpless as she pretended to be. Reina stayed there for a long moment, letting the rain wash over her, letting the cold seep back into her bones. Then she stood, brushed the mud from her uniform, and turned to head back to the fortress. She'd taken exactly 3 steps when she realized she wasn't alone. Someone stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her. Someone who'd seen everything. The figure didn't move. Reina's breath stopped in her throat, and every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run. But her legs had turned to stone, rooted to the mud-slicked ground as surely as the ancient pillars surrounding her. The rain fell harder now, a curtain of water that blurred the edges of the world, but she could still make out the silhouette standing between 2 crumbling columns at the clearing's edge. Tall, broad-shouldered, utterly still. Watching. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. A guard from the fortress who'd followed her. A hunter from one of the border packs. A traveler who'd stumbled into forbidden lands and witnessed something that would get her killed before sunrise. She should say something. Should lie, should grovel, should drop to her knees and beg for mercy the way any terrified servant would. But the power still hummed beneath her skin, not quite settled, and some part of her, the part that remembered who she'd been before the curse, refused to bow. The figure stepped forward. One step, then another, moving with a fluid grace that sent recognition skittering down her spine like ice water. She knew that walk. Had seen it 100 times from a distance, always careful to keep her eyes down, to make herself invisible. Lightning split the sky, and for one terrible, crystalline moment, the clearing blazed white with light. The Alpha King stood 10 feet away from her, rain streaming down his face, his dark eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the earth itself. Kellen. The name whispered through her mind unbidden, though she'd never spoken it aloud. In the fortress, he was only ever Your Majesty, or the Alpha King, or occasionally His Grace, when the nobles were feeling particularly obsequious. But she'd heard the servants whisper his name late at night when they thought no one important was listening. Kellen. Wolf-blessed. Undefeated in battle. Crowned at 23 after his father had died in a border skirmish that everyone suspected was an assassination. The most powerful alpha in 3 territories, and he was standing in the ruins of her people's temple, staring at her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. Reina's hand moved instinctively to the pendant at her throat, but she forced herself to stop. Any movement might trigger a predator's instinct to chase. And despite the human skin he wore, despite the fine black coat that clung to his shoulders and the civilized lines of his face, Kellen was very much a predator. She could see it in the way he held himself, balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. Could see it in the slight tilt of his head as he studied her, nostrils flaring as he pulled her scent into his lungs and tried to parse what she was. Could see it in his eyes, dark brown shot through with veins of amber that caught the moonlight and reflected it back like burnished gold. Wolf eyes. Ancient and knowing and utterly inhuman. Reina. Her name on his lips felt like a brand. She flinched and hated herself for it. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Alphas noticed everything. You know my name. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, barely a tremor threading through the words. Small victories. She'd take them where she could find them. I know everyone's name. He took another step closer, and she fought the urge to back away. I know you work in the West Wing. 3rd shift, mostly. You clean the Great Hall after the evening meal and replace the torch oil in the upper corridors. You've been with us for. He paused, and something flickered across his face that might have been surprise. 2 years, 3 months, 16 days. The exact count. He knew the exact count. Reina's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack. How did he know? She'd been so careful, so invisible. Servants came and went constantly in a fortress that size, dozens of faces that blurred together into one faceless mass of gray uniforms and bowed heads. She was supposed to be no one. Nothing. You've been counting. She said it like an accusation because she didn't know what else to do with the information. Kellen's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I count everything that enters my territory. He moved again, circling slightly to the left, and Reina's body turned to track him automatically. Never take your eyes off a predator. I count the guards at each gate, the supplies in each storage room, the wolves in each patrol. And I count the people who work in my home, especially the ones who he stopped, his gaze sharpening. The ones who don't belong. The words hit her like a physical blow. She felt her face go cold, then hot, then cold again as blood rushed away from her skin and then flooded back. He knew. Somehow he knew. I don't know what you mean. The lie tasted like ash. Don't you? Kellen had stopped moving, but he seemed closer somehow, as though the space between them had contracted while she wasn't paying attention. You're very good, Reina. I'll give you that. You keep your head down, your voice quiet. You blend in with the others so well that most of the household probably couldn't pick you out of a crowd. But there's one thing you can't hide. He took a breath, deep and deliberate, pulling the rain-soaked air into his lungs. His eyes drifted closed for just a moment, and when they opened again, they were glowing amber-bright in the darkness. Your scent. Reina's blood turned to ice. No. She'd been so careful with the herbs, the oils, the binding spells that masked what she was. She'd renewed them every morning without fail, layers upon layers of protection that should have made her smell like nothing more than soap and sweat, and the generic human-adjacent scent of someone with barely a drop of wolf blood in their veins. But Kellen was shaking his head slowly, as though he could hear her thoughts and wanted to correct them. It's wrong, he said, his voice dropping to something low and rough that vibrated through her chest. Whatever you're using to hide it, it's effective, but it's not perfect. Underneath all those layers, there's something. He trailed off, frustration flickering across his face. I've been trying to identify it for months. It's been driving me half mad. Months. He'd been aware of her for months. So you followed me. She meant it as an accusation, but it came out more like a question. I followed you. He said it without hesitation, without apology. You disappeared from the servants' corridor 43 minutes ago. You should have been in the kitchens, helping with the after-dinner cleanup. But you weren't. And when I went looking, I found a section of wall that shouldn't move but does, and a tunnel that leads into lands my pack hasn't entered in over 20 years. 23 years. Reina thought, but didn't say. 23 years since you burned our temple and slaughtered my people and declared these lands cursed so no one would ever discover what you'd done. But she kept her face carefully blank, her expression hovering somewhere between confused and frightened, the look of a servant caught doing something forbidden, but not dangerous. Just a girl sneaking out for reasons she'd rather not explain. Maybe meeting a lover. Maybe stealing a few hours of freedom. Anything but the truth. Kellen's eyes narrowed. You're good at that too. At what? Lying without speaking. He moved again, and this time she did back up a step, her heel catching on a piece of broken stone. She stumbled, and his hand shot out faster than should have been possible, and caught her elbow, steadying her before she could fall. The contact burned. Not literally, though it felt like it should have. His palm against her arm sent a jolt of something hot and electric racing up to her shoulder and then down her spine, pulling low in her belly in a way that made her gasp. She jerked back, and he let her go immediately, but his eyes had gone wide with something that looked dangerously close to shock. He felt it too. Whatever that was. What are you? The question came out rough, almost desperate, and for the first time since he'd appeared, Kellen looked uncertain. I'm no one. Reina forced the words through numb lips. Just a maid. I needed air, I came for a walk, I didn't know these lands were forbidden. Stop. The command cracked through the clearing like a whip, and she felt her jaw snap shut reflexively. Alpha voice. She'd heard him use it in the fortress, always from a distance, but up close it was a living force that wrapped around her bones and demanded obedience. But beneath her skin, her own power stirred, restless and irritated at being ordered around. She felt it push back against the compulsion, not enough to break it but enough to resist, and Kellen's eyes widened further. "You're resisting." He said it like he'd just witnessed a miracle. Or a heresy. "How are you resisting?" Reina said nothing. Couldn't say anything, even if she wanted to. The Alpha command held her tongue hostage, but her silence seemed to speak volumes. Kellen ran a hand through his wet hair, shoving it back from his face in a gesture that looked more human than anything else he'd done. Frustrated. Confused. The great Alpha King, reduced to uncertainty by a servant girl in a soaked gray uniform. If the situation weren't so terrifying, it might have been funny. "I'm not going to hurt you." He said it quietly, his voice dropping back to something that sounded almost gentle. Almost. "But I need the truth, Reina. I need to know what you were doing here, in these ruins, speaking a language that's been dead for." "You speak it." The words burst out before she could stop them, surprise overriding caution. "You understood what I was saying." Something dark flickered across Kellen's face. "I know many languages. It's required of an Alpha to understand the history of the territories under his rule. Even the ugly parts." He took a breath. "Even the parts we're supposed to forget." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. He knew what this place was. Knew what his family had done here. And he'd followed her anyway, watched her kneel before the altar, listened to her speak prayers to a goddess his bloodline had declared heretic. He should kill her. Right now, in these ruins, with no witnesses. It would be clean, efficient, and completely within his rights as Alpha King. One swift strike, and the last heir of the Silver Moon line would die where her people's temple had fallen. But he didn't move. Just stood there in the rain, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "I'm not going to kill you," he said, and she realized she must have let something show on her face. "Despite what you clearly think of me. You don't know what I think of you. Don't I?" His lips curved into something bitter. "You flinch every time you see me in the corridors. You keep your eyes down like I'm something that might burn you if you look directly at it. You serve my meals and clean my floors and hate me with every breath you take." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the water droplets caught in his eyelashes, close enough to see the faint scars that crossed his left cheekbone. "You think I can't smell rage, Reina? You think I don't recognize the scent of someone who would kill me if they could?" Her breath hitched. He did know. He'd always known. "Then why let me live?" The question came out raw, stripped of pretense. "Why let me serve in your household if you knew I wanted you dead?" Because wanting someone dead and being able to kill them are two very different things. Kellen's voice had gone soft, but there was something dangerous in the softness. And because he stopped, jaw clenching, and for a moment he looked like he was fighting some internal battle. "Because my wolf won't let me." Reina blinked. "What?" "My wolf." He said it through gritted teeth, like the admission was being pulled out of him against his will. "It recognized something in you the first night you arrived. I was holding court in the Great Hall, some border dispute I can't even remember now, and you walked in with the other new servants. You kept your head down, your scent hidden, everything perfect. But when you passed my throne, he made a frustrated sound. My wolf lost its mind." She stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "It wanted to follow you," Kellen continued, the words coming faster now, like a dam had broken. "Wanted to track you through the halls, learn your patterns, your scent, the sound of your heartbeat. I thought I was going insane. An Alpha doesn't fixate on servants. We don't even notice them most of the time. They're just part of the landscape, no different than the furniture or the walls. But you." He broke off, running both hands through his hair now, and when he looked at her again, his eyes were pure amber. "Pure wolf. I have been trying for 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days to figure out what you are and why my wolf thinks you're important. And tonight, I finally get my answer." He gestured at the altar, at the ruins, at the fading traces of power that still clung to the air like perfume. Your Silvermoon. The word fell between them like an executioner's blade. Reina felt the world tilt sideways. He'd named her line. Her blood. The heritage that should have been erased so thoroughly that even the name had turned to dust. But he'd spoken it like it was common knowledge, like he'd always known, and she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't. How long have you known? Her voice was barely a whisper. For certain? About 30 seconds. Kellen's expression had gone hard, unreadable. But I've suspected since the moment you walked into my hall. There was only ever one bloodline that could resist Alpha Command. Only ever one line that could hide their scent so thoroughly even trained wolves couldn't parse it. And only ever one family that could make my wolf react like a hound scenting something it's been bred to hunt. Hunt. The word made her stomach drop. So you did follow me here to kill me? No, the denial was immediate, almost violent. I followed you because I needed to know. Needed to understand what you were doing here, in forbidden lands, on the full moon. He moved closer again, and this time she had nowhere to retreat. Her back was against the altar, cold stone pressing into her spine. I followed you because my wolf demanded it. Because for 2 years I've been going slowly insane trying to reconcile what I know you must be with what every instinct I possess is screaming at me. And what is it screaming? She shouldn't ask. Didn't want to know. But the question fell out anyway. Kellen stopped less than an arm's length away, so close she could feel the heat radiating off his body despite the rain, could smell the complex layering of his scent, pine and smoke and something darker, something that made her mouth water even as her mind recoiled. Mate. The word hung in the air between them, impossible and undeniable. That's insane. Reina pushed away from the altar, tried to circle around him, but he moved with her, keeping the distance constant. I'm your enemy. Your family slaughtered mine. She stopped, mind racing. You're lying. This is some kind of trick to make me confess. Do I look like I'm happy about this? Kellen's voice cracked with frustration. Do I look like this is what I wanted? You're right, you're my enemy. Your bloodline and mine have been at war for 300 years. Your people tried to overthrow my grandfather. They tried to claim the throne using forbidden magic and nearly tore the territories apart in the process. And when they failed, when the other packs united against them, they swore vengeance on every alpha who'd stood against them. Your grandfather murdered children. The words ripped out of her, 2 years of suppressed fury finally breaking free. He burned the temple with families inside. He declared my entire line traitors and hunted us like animals. Whatever my ancestors did, it didn't justify genocide. I know. The admission shocked her into silence. Kellen's face had gone bleak. I know what he did. I've read the records, the real ones, not the official histories. I know how many died and how many of them were innocent. I know the Silvermoon line was destroyed not because of what they'd done, but because of what they might do. He looked away, jaw tight. I know my family's hands are soaked in blood that can never be washed clean. Reina felt something crack in her chest. She'd expected denial. Expected justification and excuses, and the kind of royal arrogance that rewrote history to suit whoever held the crown. She hadn't expected this, raw honesty that sounded like it cost him something to speak. Then why am I still in chains? She touched the pendant at her throat, the symbol of the curse binding her to this place. If you know the truth, if you acknowledge what was done, why haven't you freed me? Because I can't. The words came out flat, final. The curse binding you isn't mine. It was placed by the Council of Elders 23 years ago, woven into pack law itself. Only they can undo it, and he stopped, something dangerous flickering across his face. They would rather die than release the last Silvermoon from her debt. So I'm trapped. Forever. Until the debt is paid. Kellen's voice had gone careful. That's the wording of the curse. Until the blood debt of your line is satisfied. And how Reina asked, hearing the bitterness leak into every syllable, does one repay a debt for crimes they didn't commit? Crimes that happened before they were born. Kellen said nothing. Because there was no answer. There never had been. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady drum of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Reina felt suddenly, overwhelmingly tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of hating. Tired of being someone she wasn't, living a life that had been forced on her by bloodlines and vendettas and a history she'd had no part in writing. "Why did you really follow me?" she asked quietly. The truth this time. Kellen met her eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Conflict. Hunger. Something that looked almost like desperation. "Because," he said, voice low and rough, "I had to know if you felt it too." Felt what? He moved then, closing the distance between them in one fluid step, and caught her hand before she could pull away. His fingers were warm against her rain-chilled skin, his palm pressed against hers, and the contact sent that same electric jolt racing through her nervous system, stronger this time, impossible to ignore. "That," he said. "Tell me you feel it. Tell me I'm not losing my mind." Reina wanted to lie. Wanted to deny everything, to pull away and run back to the fortress and bury herself so deeply in the role of invisible maid that even she would forget who she really was. But her hand was burning where it touched his, and her wolf was stirring beneath her skin, the wolf she'd kept locked down for so long it had nearly become a ghost, and it was reaching toward him with a yearning that terrified her. "I feel it." The admission was barely a breath. "I've felt it since the first night. I thought," she stopped, swallowed hard. "I thought I was going insane too." Kellen's eyes closed briefly, something that looked like relief washing over his features. "It's the mate bond. Or the beginning of one. I don't know how it's possible, given everything, but," he opened his eyes again, and they were burning amber bright. "My wolf claims you. Has claimed you since the moment you entered my territory. And unless I'm completely misreading this, yours is claiming me back." "No." The denial rose in her throat, but she couldn't force it past her lips. Because he was right. Her wolf, that part of herself she'd suppressed and starved and tried to kill, was straining toward him with a single-minded intensity that made her bones ache. "Mate," it whispered. "Ours. Mine. This doesn't change anything," she said desperately. "You're still the man whose family destroyed yours." "I know." Kellen's grip on her hand tightened fractionally. "And you're still the woman who would kill me in my sleep if you thought you could get away with it." "I know that too." "Then what do we do?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I have no idea. This situation, it's impossible. If my court finds out what you are, they'll demand your execution. If your power is discovered, the council will declare you a threat and move to eliminate you before you can gather enough strength to challenge us. And if anyone realizes the Alpha King has formed a mate bond with the last heir of the Silvermoon line," he shook his head, "it would start a war. Maybe a civil war. Certainly a coup. So we pretend it doesn't exist." Reina tried to pull her hand away, but he held firm. "You go back to being the Alpha King, and I go back to being a maid, and we both forget this ever happened. Can you do that?" His voice was soft, almost gentle. "Can you go back to hating me now that you know?" She wanted to say yes. Wanted to lie and mean it. But the bond between them was singing, and her wolf was awake for the first time in years, and standing here with rain streaming down her face and his hand wrapped around hers felt more real than anything she'd experienced in the 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days since she'd arrived at his fortress. "No," she whispered. "I don't think I can." "Neither can I." Kellen lifted his free hand slowly, telegraphing the movement, and brushed a strand of wet hair away from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and she found herself leaning into the touch before she could stop herself. "So we find another way. Somehow. We find a way to break your curse, to satisfy this blood debt, he stopped, a muscle in his jaw ticking. "To have something that isn't built on the bones of the dead. That's impossible. Everything about this is impossible." He smiled, and it was crooked and tired and absolutely genuine. "Might as well aim high." The rain had softened to a whisper by the time Kellen finally stepped back, releasing her hand with obvious reluctance. The loss of contact left Reina feeling strangely hollow, as though some essential piece of herself had been carved away and taken with him. She wrapped her arms around her middle, suddenly aware of how cold she was, how thoroughly soaked, how dangerously exposed she'd let herself become. You should go back. Kellen's voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the strain beneath it. If you're gone much longer, someone will notice. The night shift supervisor does rounds at midnight. Reina glanced at the sky, trying to gauge the time by the moon's position, but thick clouds still obscured most of the light. How long have we been here? Too long. He turned away from her, scanning the tree line with the automatic wariness of someone who'd spent a lifetime guarding against threats. I'll follow at a distance. Make sure you get back safely. I don't need protection. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, defensive instinct overriding common sense. Kellen looked back at her, one eyebrow raised. These lands are forbidden for a reason, Reina. There are things in this forest that would be more than happy to find a lone wolf. He stopped, correcting himself. A lone person wandering in the dark. I've been coming here for months. She lifted her chin, refusing to back down. I know how to avoid the dangers. The Reavers? Her stomach dropped. What? The Reavers. Kellen's expression had gone grim. Shadow creatures that feed on wolf essence. They nest in the deep forest, especially in places soaked with old blood and older magic. Places like, he gestured at the ruins surrounding them, like temples where massacres happened. You didn't think the stories about cursed lands were completely fiction, did you? Reina felt her face go numb. She'd heard whispers about Reavers every wolf had. They were the nightmare stories told to cubs to keep them from wandering into dangerous territory. Creatures that were neither living nor dead, that existed in the spaces between shadows and fed on the life force of anything with wolf blood. She'd always assumed they were myth, exaggerated folklore meant to enforce pack boundaries. But Kellen was watching her with an expression that said he knew exactly what she was thinking and that she was wrong. They're real, she said slowly. They're real. He moved back toward her, not quite close enough to touch, but near enough that she could feel his body heat. And they're attracted to power. Especially the kind of power you were throwing around when I arrived. You're lucky I got here when I did. Another few minutes, and you would have drawn every Reaver within 5 miles straight to this clearing. The words hit her like cold water. All those nights she'd come here, kneeling at the altar, letting her power breathe free, she'd thought she was safe. Thought the ruins were her sanctuary, the one place she could be herself without fear of discovery. But she'd been exposed the entire time, a beacon in the dark for things that wanted to devour her. She must have swayed, because Kellen's hand shot out to steady her again, warm and solid against her elbow. Hey, you're all right. Nothing happened. Because you were here. The admission tasted bitter. She didn't want to owe him anything, didn't want to feel grateful to the man whose family had destroyed hers. But denying facts wouldn't change them. You saved me. I protected what's mine. The words came out before he seemed to realize what he was saying, and his eyes widened fractionally. I didn't mean. I know what you meant. Reina pulled away from his touch, needing the distance even though her wolf whined at the loss. The mate bond. It makes you feel responsible. It makes me feel insane, Kellen corrected, but there was no heat in it. But yes, my wolf considers you pack now, which means protecting you is instinct. I couldn't stop myself from following you tonight any more than I could stop breathing. Reina wrapped her arms tighter around herself. Pack. The word stirred something painful in her chest, memories rising like ghosts from graves she'd thought sealed tight. She'd been pack once. Before. Before the fire. Before the curse. Before everything she'd known had burned to ash and scattered on a winter wind that still haunted her dreams. You're thinking about them. Kellen said it quietly, not quite a question. She didn't ask how he knew. Alpha's read body language the way scholars read books, fluently and with perfect comprehension. I was 5 when it happened. I barely remember them. But you remember enough. Reina closed her eyes. I remember my mother's voice. She sang while she worked old songs in the old language. She had this way of making even cleaning chores feel like rituals, like every action had meaning. The memory surfaced with painful clarity, her mother's hands moving through the air, weaving patterns while she hummed, turning mundane tasks into small acts of devotion. She taught me the prayers, made me memorize them even though I was too young to understand what they meant. She knew. Kellen's voice was soft. She knew what was coming. Maybe. Reina opened her eyes, staring at the ruined altar. Or maybe she just wanted me to remember who I was. What I came from. She laughed, but it came out jagged. Lot of good it did. I spent the next 13 years hiding every word she taught me, terrified that speaking them would get me killed. Until tonight. Until tonight. She turned to look at him, this man who should be her enemy, who was her enemy, except for the bond humming between them that made lies impossible. I couldn't help it. Coming here, speaking the prayers, it's the only thing that keeps me sane. The only time I can remember that I'm not just a maid in a gray uniform. That I used to be someone. Kellen's jaw tightened. You're still someone. Am I? The question came out raw. I don't even know anymore. Reina the maid feels more real than Reina the Silvermoon heir. That girl, the one I was supposed to be, she died in the fire with everyone else. What's left is just, she gestured helplessly at herself. An echo. A ghost pretending to be alive. You're not a ghost. Then what am I? She heard her voice rising, but couldn't stop it. I'm not Pack. I haven't had a pack since I was 5 years old. I'm not free, this curse makes sure of that. I'm not even really a wolf anymore, because I've kept that part of myself locked down for so long I'm not sure I remember how to shift. So tell me, Alpha King, what exactly am I if not a ghost? The words hung in the air between them, edged with all the grief and fury she'd been swallowing for 18 years. She expected anger. Expected him to remind her that she was alive when hundreds of her people were dead, that survival was something, that she should be grateful. Instead, Kellen looked at her with something that might have been understanding. You're surviving, he said simply. In a situation that would have broken most people. Against enemies who have every advantage. With no allies, no resources, no hope of escape. He paused. That's not nothing, Reina. It feels like nothing. The admission slipped out before she could stop it. Every day, scrubbing floors and keeping my head down and pretending to be something I'm not, it feels like dying slowly. Like watching myself disappear piece by piece until there's nothing left but the uniform and the role. Is that why you come here? Kellen glanced at the altar, then back to her. To remember? To breathe. She moved toward the altar without thinking, her fingers finding the carved symbol again. The stone was cold now, the power she'd raised earlier fully dissipated. In the fortress, I have to hold everything in. Every emotion, every instinct, every drop of power. I have to be small and quiet and forgettable. But here, her voice caught. Here I can be big. Just for a little while. Just long enough to remember what it feels like. Kellen was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough. How long were you alone? After the fire. The question pulled her back to memories she tried not to examine too closely. 3 months. There was a group of survivors, maybe 20 of us, mostly children and a few adults who'd been away during the attack. We hid in the northern territories, moving from one abandoned den to another, trying to stay ahead of the hunters. Hunters. Kellen's voice went flat. Your grandfather's men. She said it without inflection, stating fact. They tracked down every survivor they could find. Wanted to make sure the Silvermoon line was completely erased. She traced the crescent moon carved into the altar. I was hidden in a root cellar when they found our group. I heard, she stopped, swallowed hard. I heard the screaming. It lasted hours. Kellen made a sound low in his throat, something between a growl and a curse. I'm sorry. Are you? She looked at him sharply. Or are you just sorry that it makes things complicated between us? Both. The honesty surprised her. I'm sorry that my family did that to yours. I'm sorry that you spent your childhood running and hiding and watching people die. And yes, I'm sorry that it makes this," he gestured between them. "Whatever this is, infinitely more complicated than it already was." Reina felt something in her chest loosen fractionally. At least he wasn't pretending. Wasn't trying to minimize or justify or explain away atrocities with political necessity. He was just acknowledging it, seeing her pain and naming it for what it was. It didn't fix anything, but it was something. "After they killed the others, I ran." She found herself talking, words spilling out in a way she hadn't allowed herself in years. "I was 8 years old and alone in territory I didn't know, with no pack and no protection. I should have died a dozen times over. But you didn't." "No," she smiled bitterly. "I was too stubborn. Or too stupid. I don't know which." She'd survived by stealing, by hiding, by learning to make herself invisible in ways that went beyond physical stealth. She'd taught herself to suppress her scent, to walk without sound, to sense danger before it found her. Skills that had eventually caught the attention of someone who could use them. The elder found me when I was 12. The memory still tasted like ashes. I'd been living in the ruins of an old farmhouse, surviving on what I could scavenge. She appeared one night like a shadow with eyes, and I thought she laughed humorlessly. I thought she was going to help me. Thought I'd finally found another survivor who would take me in. Instead, she cursed you. Kellen's voice was hard. Instead, she gave me a choice. Reina met his eyes. Die alone in those ruins, or accept the curse and live. Serve the Alpha King's household, work off my family's blood debt, and eventually, maybe, earn my freedom. She touched the pendant at her throat. This is the binding. It keeps me alive, keeps me fed and sheltered. But it also chains me to your territory. If I try to leave, it tightens around my throat until I can't breathe. If I speak about my true identity to anyone, the words turn to ash in my mouth. If I fail in my duties," she stopped. "Let's just say the consequences are unpleasant." Kellen's hands had curled into fists. What kind of elder would do that to a child? The kind who believed she was being merciful. Reina's voice was flat. "She told me I was lucky. That most of the other survivors had been given no choice at all. At least this way, I had a chance at life. Even if it was a half-life, a shadow existence, it was better than death." "And you believed her?" "I was 12 and starving and so tired of running." Reina felt the old exhaustion settle over her shoulders like a familiar weight. "Yes, I believed her. What else was I going to do?" Kellen moved closer, and this time she didn't pull away when he reached for her. His hands settled on her shoulders, warm and solid, and she found herself leaning into the contact despite every instinct screaming at her to maintain distance. "You were a child," he said quietly. "You deserved protection, not punishment for crimes you didn't commit. What was done to you, what continues to be done to you, it's wrong, Reina. You know that, right?" She wanted to argue. Wanted to say that she deserved it, that her bloodline was guilty, that the curse was justice in action. The words had been drilled into her for so long they'd become automatic, a reflexive defense against the pain of acknowledging how unfair it all was. But standing here with Kellen's hands on her shoulders and his amber eyes searching her face, the lies wouldn't come. "I know," she whispered. "But knowing doesn't change anything. Maybe not tonight." His thumbs brushed against her collarbone, a small gesture that sent warmth cascading through her. "But things can change, Reina. They will change. You sound very certain." "I'm an Alpha King." He smiled, and it was crooked and a little wild. "Certainty is part of the job description, even when I'm making it up as I go." Despite everything, the cold, the fear, the impossible situation they were trapped in, Reina felt her lips curve into something that might have been a smile. "So, what do we do now?" Kellen's expression sobered. "Now, we get you back to the fortress before anyone notices you're gone. Tomorrow," he paused, clearly thinking it through. "Tomorrow I start looking for ways to break your curse. Quietly. Very quietly. The council will never agree. Then I'll find a way around the council. His voice hardened with determination. There are laws older than pack law, Reina. Ancient agreements and forgotten treaties. If I have to dig through every dusty archive in the kingdom to find a loophole, I will. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to let herself hope that maybe, possibly, there was a way out of this cage she'd been locked in for 6 years. But hope was dangerous. Hope made you vulnerable, made you soft, made you forget that the world was cruel and justice was a fairy tale told to children. Why? The question came out smaller than she'd intended. Why would you do that for me? Kellen's eyes met hers, and the intensity there made her breath catch. Because you're my mate. Because what was done to you was wrong. Because he stopped, then continued more quietly. Because when I look at you, I don't see an enemy. I see someone who's been fighting alone for far too long. And his voice roughened. I can't stand the thought of you spending another day suffering because of crimes my family committed. The words hit her square in the chest, cracking something open that she'd kept sealed for years. Tears burned at the back of her throat, but she refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough in her life. Cried herself to sleep in that root cellar while her people screamed and died above her. Cried in the farmhouse ruins when hunger and loneliness became too much to bear. Cried the night the elder had fastened the curse around her neck and told her to be grateful. She was done crying. But standing here with Kellen looking at her like she mattered, like she was worth fighting for, made her want to break that vow. I should go. She stepped back, putting distance between them before she did something stupid like throw herself at him, or let the tears fall, or admit how desperately lonely she'd been for so long that his offered kindness felt like sunlight after 18 years of winter. You're right about the rounds. If I'm not back soon. I know. Kellen let her go, but his eyes tracked her movement like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her again. I'll follow at a distance. Don't look back, don't acknowledge me. As far as anyone knows, you went for a walk and came back. Nothing more. Reina nodded, then hesitated. There was something she needed to say, words that had been locked behind her teeth for so long she wasn't sure she remembered how to speak them. But he'd been honest with her. Brutally, dangerously honest, and she owed him the same. Kellen. His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that using his title never had. Thank you. She swallowed. For not being what I expected. His smile was soft and a little sad. You're not what I expected either. Which is, he laughed quietly. Probably the biggest understatement of my life. She turned before she could lose her nerve, moving quickly across the clearing toward the path that would lead her back to the tunnel, back to the fortress, back to the gray uniform and the bowed head and the life of servitude that suddenly felt even more suffocating than before. Because now she knew what it was like to stand in moonlight and speak her truth. Knew what it was like to be seen, really seen, by someone who should hate her but didn't. Knew what it felt like to have an ally, even if that ally was the last person in the world she should trust. And going back to pretending she was no one after that felt like trying to shove her soul back into a box 3 sizes too small. But she did it anyway. Because survival meant adaptation. Meant doing what was necessary no matter how much it hurt. She'd been doing it for 18 years. She could do it for one more day. 3 days passed like a fever dream. Reina moved through the fortress in her usual pattern, scrubbing, serving, staying invisible, but everything felt different now. The weight of Kellen's gaze followed her through corridors she'd walked 1,000 times. She'd catch glimpses of him at the edge of her vision, standing in a doorway she'd just passed, watching from the gallery above the great hall, present in ways he'd never been before. Or perhaps he'd always been there, and she'd simply been too careful about not looking to notice. The other servants whispered about it. The Alpha King had become restless, they said. Prowling the fortress at odd hours, asking strange questions, spending long nights in the archives instead of attending court functions. Some speculated he was preparing for war. Others suggested a political marriage was being negotiated, and he was having second thoughts. No one suspected the truth. That the Alpha King was hunting for a way to break a curse that had been written into pack law itself. That he was searching for salvation for a girl whose very existence should demand her execution. That he was losing sleep over a maid who'd stolen his wolf's loyalty without even trying. Reina tried not to think about it. Tried to focus on her work, on surviving each day without drawing attention. But at night, alone in her narrow servant's bed, she would touch the pendant at her throat and remember the feeling of Kellen's hands on her shoulders. The warmth in his eyes when he'd looked at her like she was something precious instead of something cursed. It was dangerous. All of it. The bond growing stronger between them, the hope beginning to take root in her chest, the way her wolf had started to wake fully for the first time since she'd accepted the curse. Dangerous and foolish and probably doomed to end in disaster. But she couldn't seem to stop it. On the fourth night, everything changed. Reina was finishing her rounds in the upper corridors when she heard footsteps behind her, quick and purposeful. She turned, expecting a guard or another servant, and found Kellen striding toward her with an expression that made her heart leap into her throat. "Come with me." He didn't slow down, just caught her hand as he passed and pulled her along with him. "Now, Your Majesty, She tried to sound appropriately deferential in case anyone was listening, but he cut her off. "Don't." His voice was low and urgent. "Not right now. Just trust me." She should pull away. Should insist on propriety, on maintaining the careful distance that had kept her alive this long. But his hand was warm around hers, and there was something in his expression, excitement mixed with apprehension, that made her follow without further protest. He led her through a maze of corridors she'd never entered, each one narrower and dustier than the last, until they reached a door she'd never noticed before. Heavy oak bound with iron, covered in symbols that made her skin prickle with recognition. Warding marks. Protection sigils. The kind of magic that predated the Alpha King's reign by centuries. Kellen produced a key from his pocket, old iron, ornate, the sort of thing that looked like it belonged in a museum, and fitted it into the lock. The door opened with a sound like a sigh, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. The archives? Reina guessed. The real archives. Kellen glanced back at her, and his eyes were bright with something that looked dangerously close to hope. The ones that existed before my grandfather tried to rewrite history. Come on. She followed him downstairs that seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. Torches flickered to life as they passed, responding to some ancient enchantment, revealing walls lined with shelves that stretched up into shadows. Books. Scrolls. Documents bound in leather and sealed with wax. The accumulated knowledge of centuries, hidden away where most people would never find it. Where most people would never think to look. Kellen led her to a table in the center of the vast space, where several books lay open, their pages covered in text that seemed to shimmer faintly in the torchlight. He released her hand, reluctantly, she noticed, and gestured at the display. "I've been here for 3 nights," he said without preamble. "Reading everything I could find about the Silvermoon line, about blood curses, about pack law and how it's enforced." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his tell when he was agitated. Most of it was useless. Propaganda from my grandfather's reign, official histories that painted your people as monsters who deserved what happened to them. Reina's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She'd heard those stories before. But then I found this. Kellen picked up one of the books, ancient, the leather binding cracked with age, and opened it to a marked page. It's a record from the original founding of the territories. Before there were Alpha Kings, before pack law as we know it existed. Back when the wolves were organized into bloodline houses, each with their own sovereignty. He turned the book so she could see the page, and Reina's breath caught. The text was written in the old language, the one her mother had taught her, the one she'd spoken at the altar. And there, rendered in fading ink, was a symbol she knew as well as her own heartbeat. The Silvermoon crest. The crescent embracing a star. Your house wasn't just powerful, Kellen continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd memorized the words. It was sacred. The silver moon line were the moon's chosen, blessed with the ability to speak directly to the goddess, to channel her power, to serve as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal. They weren't conquerors or warriors. They were priests. Reina felt the room tilt slightly. That's not the stories say we tried to overthrow. The stories lie. Kellen's voice was hard. Or at least, they tell a very incomplete version of the truth. Yes, your ancestors opposed the formation of the Alpha King system. But not because they wanted power for themselves. Because he pointed to a passage in the text. Because the goddess forbade it. What? Kellen began to read, his voice quiet but clear in the vast silence of the archives. And the moon spoke to her chosen, saying, the wolves were made to run in packs, not kingdoms. To bow to the land, not to crowns. To honor the old ways, not new laws written by those who hunger for dominion. Should the houses unite under a single rule, should one bloodline claim sovereignty over all others, the balance will break. And when balance breaks, so too will the wolves. The words hung in the air like smoke. Reina's hands had started to shake. That's the prophecy, Kellen said softly. The reason your house fought against the Alpha King system. Not ambition. Not a grab for power. They were trying to prevent what they saw as a fundamental betrayal of wolf nature. He closed the book carefully. They lost. Obviously. The other houses united anyway, chose my ancestor as their king, and the Silver Moon line was declared heretic for opposing the will of the majority. And then slaughtered for it. Reina's voice came out hollow. And then slaughtered for it, Kellen agreed. But here's what my grandfather couldn't destroy, because he didn't know it existed. He moved to another book, this one even older, the pages so fragile they looked like they might crumble at a touch. There's a second part to the prophecy. One that was kept secret, known only to the Silver Moon priestesses and passed down through oral tradition. He didn't read this time, just recited from memory, and Reina realized he must have spent hours memorizing every word. When the balance breaks and wolves bow to crowns instead of moon, the land will sicken and the packs will tear themselves apart from within. War will breed war, and blood will answer blood, until the chosen line rises again. She who is lost will return. She who carries the silver flame will kneel at the ancient altar and speak the words of binding. And when she does, the false king will have a choice: release what was stolen, or watch his kingdom burn. Silence crashed over them like a wave. Reina couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The words echoed in her head, each one striking like a hammer against stone. She who is lost. She who carries the silver flame. The ancient altar. That's me. The words came out barely above a whisper. That prophecy is about me. Kellen's expression was unreadable. I think so. Yes. And the false king, she looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the tension in every line of his body. That's you. That's me. He said it flatly, without emotion, but she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. Or my position, at least. The prophecy doesn't care about individuals. It cares about systems. About power structures that the goddess never sanctioned. Reina's mind was racing, trying to process implications that felt too vast to hold. So what you're saying is that my entire bloodline was destroyed to suppress a prophecy that's now coming true anyway. Yes. And I'm supposed to what? Demand that you give up your throne? Dissolve the Alpha King system entirely? That would, she laughed, but it came out slightly unhinged. That would start a civil war. Every pack in the territories would tear itself apart fighting over who gets power next. It would be chaos. I know. People would die. Thousands of people. I know. Kellen moved closer, and she could see something desperate in his eyes. But there's more. Look at this. He pulled out another scroll, unfurling it to reveal what looked like a map of the territories. But instead of marking borders and cities, it was covered in symbols and notations that seemed to track something else entirely. For the last 100 years, Kellen said quietly, The territories have been destabilizing. Slowly, so slowly that most people haven't noticed. But the border disputes are getting more violent. The challenges for alpha positions are turning deadly more often. Packs that used to cooperate are feuding over resources. And the land itself, he pointed to clusters of symbols. Areas where the forests are dying. Where prey animals are disappearing. Where the earth feels wrong to anyone with enough power to sense it. Reina studied the map, her stomach sinking as patterns began to emerge. The clusters of symbols radiated out from a central point, the location of the Alpha King's fortress. The place where her people's temple had been destroyed. Where the balance had first been broken. The prophecy is already manifesting, she said slowly. The land is sickening. The packs are tearing themselves apart. It's been happening all along, we didn't connect it to the prophecy because we didn't know the prophecy existed. Exactly. Kellen's voice was grim. My grandfather tried to erase your bloodline to prevent the prophecy from coming true. But all he did was guarantee it would happen eventually, and by the time it did, things would be so unstable that the consequences would be catastrophic. Reina's legs felt suddenly unsteady. She sank into a chair, her mind whirling. So, what do we do? I don't even know what speaking the words of binding means. And even if I did, even if I somehow managed to fulfill this prophecy, what happens then? Do I demand you abdicate? Do I watch everything collapse into war? Do I? There's a third option. Kellen knelt in front of her chair, bringing himself to eye level. The prophecy says the false king must release what was stolen. I've been trying to figure out what that means, and I think he took a breath. I think it means the curse. The blood debt that was imposed on your line. If I can find a way to break it, to officially pardon your bloodline and release you from servitude, that might be enough to satisfy the prophecy without dismantling the entire system. Hope flared in Reina's chest, bright and painful. You think it's that simple? I think nothing about this is simple. His mouth curved into something wry. But it's worth trying. The curse was imposed by pack law, which means it can be revoked by pack law. I'm the Alpha King. I have the authority to issue pardons, to overturn previous rulings. The council won't like it, but technically they can't stop me. Technically. Reina heard the doubt in her own voice. Kellen, the council exists specifically to prevent the Alpha King from having absolute power. If you try to overturn a curse they imposed, they'll fight you. And they have enough support among the packs to make it a real fight. Then I'll fight. His voice was steel wrapped in velvet. I'll use every political tool I have, call in every favor, make whatever deals are necessary. But I'm not, he stopped, jaw clenched. I'm not going to let you spend another day enslaved because of my family's crimes. I can't fix what my grandfather did. Can't bring back the people who died. But I can fix this. I will fix this. The intensity in his eyes made her chest tight. Why does this matter so much to you? Is it just the mate bond or... It's justice. The word came out fierce. It's doing what's right, even when it's hard. Even when it costs me. He reached up, his hand hovering near her face, but not quite touching. And yes, it's the bond. It's the fact that my wolf will tear me apart from the inside if I don't protect you. But it's also, his voice softened. It's you. You, Reina. The girl who survived when everything was stacked against her. Who kept her humanity when most people would have drowned in hatred. Who still kneels at a ruined altar and prays to a goddess who might not even be listening because hope is all you have left. Tears burned behind Reina's eyes. You don't know me well enough to say that. Don't I? His hand finally made contact, fingers gentle against her cheek. I've been watching you for 2 years. I've seen how kind you are to the other servants, even when they gossip about you. How you work twice as hard as anyone else to avoid drawing attention. How you save scraps from your meals and leave them for the stray cats in the courtyard when you think no one's watching. His thumb brushed along her cheekbone. You could have let this place turn you cruel. Could have let the curse and the hatred consume you. But you didn't. And that his voice roughened. That takes more strength than anything I've ever done. A tear escaped, tracking down her face, and Kellen caught it with his thumb. The gentleness of the gesture broke something loose in her chest. I'm scared. The admission came out small. If you try to break the curse and fail, if the council fights back and you lose, they'll execute me immediately. And even if you succeed, even if you somehow manage to free me, fulfilling the prophecy might trigger exactly the kind of chaos we're trying to prevent. Either way, this ends badly. Or it ends with you free. Kellen's eyes searched hers. With the balance restored. With a chance at something better than what we have now. You're an optimist. I'm an alpha. He smiled, but it was strained. We have to believe we can protect our pack, even when the odds are impossible. Otherwise, what's the point? Reina found herself smiling back despite everything. Your pack is several thousand wolves spread across multiple territories. I don't think I qualify. My wolf disagrees. The amber was bleeding into his eyes again, the human overlay giving way to something more primal. Your pack, Reina. You've been pack since the moment you walked into my fortress. I just didn't understand what that meant until now. The bond between them pulsed, warm and insistent, and Reina felt her own wolf rise to meet it. For 2 years she'd kept that part of herself locked down, afraid that letting it surface would expose her. But here, in the depths of the archives where no one could see, she let it breathe. Let it reach for him. Kellen's pupils dilated, and she knew he felt it, the moment her wolf acknowledged his. The silent communication that happened beneath language, a recognition that transcended words. Mate, her wolf whispered. Ours. Finally ours. Reina. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. May I? She didn't let him finish the question. Just leaned forward and closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff at the same time. He made a sound low in his throat, surprise and relief and hunger all mixed together, and his hand slid from her cheek into her hair, cradling her head as he kissed her back. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, as though he was afraid she might bolt. But when she didn't pull away, when she instead pressed closer and opened her mouth against his, the gentleness gave way to something more urgent, more real. His other hand found her waist, pulling her up from the chair and against his body, and she went willingly, her own hands fisting in his shirt as the kiss deepened. He tasted like possibility and danger, and the kind of reckless hope that got people killed. She should stop this. Should remember all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. But his mouth was on hers and his wolf was singing to hers, and for the first time in 18 years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kellen rested his forehead against hers. We're going to figure this out, he said quietly. The prophecy, the curse, all of it. I promise you, Reina. You're not alone anymore. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to let herself trust that maybe, impossibly, there was a way through this that didn't end in blood and fire. Okay, she whispered. Okay. They stood there in the archives, wrapped in each other and surrounded by centuries of forgotten knowledge, and for just a moment Reina let herself believe that prophecies could be fulfilled without destruction. That curses could be broken without war. That a Maid and an Alpha King could find a way to rewrite a story that had been written in blood long before either of them was born. She was probably wrong. But standing here in Kellen's arms, with his heart beating against hers and his promise still hanging in the air between them, she decided that being wrong was a risk worth taking. The first crack in their fragile hope came 3 days later, during the full council meeting. Reina wasn't supposed to be there. Servants rarely entered the council chambers. It was a space reserved for alphas and nobles, for the people who shaped policy and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But Kellen had specifically requested her presence, claiming he needed additional staff to serve refreshments during what he'd warned would be a lengthy session. The other servants had been grateful to avoid the assignment. Council meetings were notoriously tense, and no one wanted to be present when powerful wolves started arguing. But Reina had understood immediately what Kellen was really doing, giving her a legitimate reason to be in the room when he made his move. When he tried to overturn a curse that had stood for 23 years. She stood against the back wall now, hands clasped in front of her gray uniform, eyes down, every inch the invisible servant. But her heart was hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. The council chamber was circular, designed to give no one position more prominence than another, though everyone knew the Alpha King's seat held the real power. 12 chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each occupied by an alpha or elder who represented a major pack or bloodline. Kellen sat in the north position, his posture deceptively relaxed, but Reina could see the tension in his shoulders. She'd learned to read him over the past week. Learned the subtle tells that betrayed what he was feeling beneath the mask of alpha composure. Border disputes in the Eastern Territories have escalated again, one of the alphas was saying, a grizzled man named Garrick who led one of the largest packs. 3 skirmishes in the last month. If we don't establish clearer boundaries soon, we're going to have a full war on our hands. The boundaries are clear, another alpha countered. What we have is a problem with wolves who refuse to respect them. The argument continued, voices rising and falling as various council members weighed in. Reina kept her expression neutral, but internally she was matching the discussion to the map Kellen had shown her in the archives. The Eastern Territories, that was one of the areas marked with symbols indicating instability, where the land itself was beginning to sicken, where the prophecy was manifesting. Kellen let the debate continue for several minutes before he raised his hand, and silence fell immediately. The gesture was slight, barely more than a lifting of his fingers, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The border disputes are a symptom, he said quietly, not the disease. We can redraw boundaries all we want, but it won't address the underlying problem. Garrick frowned. And what problem is that, Your Majesty? The territories are destabilizing. Kellen's voice was calm, factual. Has anyone else noticed the pattern? Increased aggression among packs. Resources becoming scarce in areas where they used to be plentiful. Challenges for alpha positions turning deadly more frequently than ever before. A few council members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a woman named Mira who served as an elder for the Western packs, spoke up. Cycles of conflict are natural, Your Majesty. The territories go through periods of tension and periods of peace. This is different. Kellen leaned forward slightly. I've had the archives researched extensively. The current level of instability is unprecedented in the last 100 years. And it's getting worse. What are you suggesting? Garrick's tone had gone wary. Kellen took a breath, and Reina felt her stomach clench. This was it. The moment everything would either move forward or fall spectacularly apart. I'm suggesting, Kellen said carefully, that we need to examine whether some of our foundational laws might be contributing to the problem. Specifically, laws that were enacted hastily, during times of conflict, without full consideration of their long-term effects. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. An elder named Theron, ancient, white-haired, with eyes like chips of ice, spoke into the silence. You're referring to the blood laws. I'm referring, Kellen said, to the curse placed on the Silvermoon line. Yes. The reaction was immediate. Half the council erupted into protest, voices overlapping as they shouted objections. Garrick slammed his hand on the arm of his chair, the sound cracking through the chamber like a whip. Absolutely not. His voice was hard as stone. The Silvermoon line were traitors who tried to destroy the pack system itself. The curse was justice, not cruelty. Justice would have been a trial. Kellen's voice cut through the noise, quiet but absolute. Justice would have been individual accountability for actual crimes. What happened instead was genocide masked as law enforcement. They opposed the Alpha King system. Another council member, a man named Darius, was on his feet now. They tried to prevent the houses from uniting, would have kept us fractured and weak. They opposed it because their goddess told them to. Kellen's voice was steel now. Because they saw something we didn't. Or refused to see. Theron's eyes had narrowed to slits. And how exactly do you know what their goddess told them, Your Majesty? The Silvermoon priestesses are dead. Their temples are ruins. Their records were destroyed. Not all of them. Kellen gestured, and a servant appeared from a side door carrying several of the ancient books from the archives. I've spent the last week in the old archives. The real archives, the ones that predate my grandfather's reign. And I've found documentation that contradicts almost everything we've been taught about the Silvermoon line. He stood, moving to the center of the circle, and Reina's breath caught. He was magnificent like this, all-controlled power and absolute conviction. An alpha in his prime, wielding authority like a weapon. The Silvermoon line weren't conquerors, Kellen continued. They were priests. Sacred keepers who served as intermediaries between wolves and the divine. They opposed the Alpha King system not out of ambition, but because they believed correctly, as it turns out, that centralizing power would destabilize the territories. That's heresy. Myra's voice was sharp. The Alpha King system has brought order and prosperity. Has it? Kellen turned to face her. Then why are we sitting here discussing border disputes that are escalating toward war? Why are resources failing in territories that used to be abundant? Why is every pack on edge, every alpha looking over their shoulder, every challenge turning into a bloodbath? Because wolves are violent by nature, Garrick shot back. Because we need strong leadership to keep that violence from consuming us. Your grandfather understood that. He did what was necessary. My grandfather committed atrocities and called them justice. Kellen's voice cracked through the chamber. He burned families alive. Hunted children through the forests like animals. Cursed survivors to lives of servitude for crimes they didn't commit. And he looked around the circle, meeting each council member's eyes. We've been perpetuating those atrocities ever since, telling ourselves it was necessary. That it kept us safe. It did keep us safe, Theron said coldly. The Silvermoon line had power that rivaled the Alpha King's own. If they'd been allowed to live, allowed to gather strength, they might have provided the balance we desperately need. Kellen moved back to his seat but remained standing. I found evidence of a prophecy. One that predicted exactly what's happening now, the destabilization, the violence, the land itself beginning to fail. And that prophecy includes a solution. The silence that fell was different now. Heavy with dread. What solution? Mira asked, though she sounded like she didn't want to know the answer. The curse must be broken. Kellen's voice was absolutely steady. The blood debt must be forgiven. The last of the Silvermoon line must be freed, or the territories will tear themselves apart. There is no last of the Silvermoon line, Darius said flatly. They're extinct. Your grandfather made sure of that. Reina's hands tightened against her uniform. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. Kellen's eyes found hers across the room, just for a moment, just a flicker of connection, before he looked back at the council. That's where you're wrong, he said quietly. The room erupted. Council members were on their feet, shouting, some in rage and some in what sounded like panic. Reina couldn't make out individual words. It was just a wall of noise, of fury and fear and accusations flying like weapons. And then Theron spoke, his voice cutting through the chaos with the kind of authority that came from centuries of accumulated power. Show us. The room fell silent. Kellen's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. Then he turned and looked directly at Reina. Come here. It wasn't an alpha command, not quite. But it carried enough weight that everyone in the room followed his gaze, turning to look at the servant standing against the back wall. At her. Reina felt her legs move before her mind could catch up. One step, then another, crossing the circular chamber while 12 of the most powerful wolves in the territories stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. She stopped beside Kellen, close enough to feel the heat radiating off him, and kept her eyes down. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear, to do anything except stand here and let herself be examined like a specimen under glass. But Kellen's hand found hers, warm and solid, and squeezed once. A silent promise. "I've got you." "This is Reina," Kellen said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "She's served in my household for 2 years, 3 months, and 23 days. She's kept her head down, done her work, drawn no attention to herself." He paused. "And she's the last living heir of the Silvermoon bloodline." The explosion of noise that followed was deafening. "Impossible. She's been here for years. How did we not know? This is a trick, some kind of political manipulation. Kill her." That was Darius, his voice cutting through the rest. "Kill her now, before she can gather power." "No." The word from Kellen wasn't shouted, but it crashed through the chamber with the force of an alpha command amplified 100-fold. Every wolf in the room felt it. Reina saw them all flinch, saw submission ripple through the council like a wave. Even Theron bowed his head slightly, though his expression remained cold as winter. "She is under my protection," Kellen continued, his voice vibrating with power. "And under pack law, no one can touch her without my permission. Is that understood?" Silence. Then, slowly, nods from around the circle. But the hatred in their eyes was unmistakable. Theron was the first to speak again, his voice carefully controlled. "How long have you known what she was? Does it matter?" "It matters very much." The elder's eyes were glacial. "If you've been harboring a Silvermoon heir knowingly, if you've kept this information from the council, that's grounds for challenging your authority. Possibly for deposing you." Reina felt Kellen tense beside her, but his voice remained steady. "I discovered her identity recently. And as soon as I did, I began researching the curse, the prophecy, and the laws surrounding both. Everything I've shared with you today is the result of that research. Research that conveniently supports breaking a curse placed by this very council." Myra's tone was acidic. "Forgive me if I'm skeptical about your motivations, Your Majesty. My motivations are irrelevant." Kellen's hand tightened around Reina's. "The curse was wrong when it was imposed. It remains wrong today. And if we don't correct this mistake, if we continue to let injustice stand because we're too proud to admit our predecessors made errors, then we deserve whatever destruction the prophecy promises." "The prophecy is Silvermoon propaganda," Garrick snarled. "Designed to make us second-guess our own authority. The prophecy is manifesting right now." Kellen gestured sharply. "Every symptom it predicted is occurring. The land is failing. The packs are fragmenting. Violence is escalating. And it will continue to get worse until we address the root cause." "Which is what?" Theron's voice was dangerous. "You think freeing one girl will somehow fix centuries of territorial politics? I think acknowledging that we committed genocide against innocent people might be a start." Kellen's voice was hard. "I think releasing the last survivor from unjust punishment might demonstrate that we're capable of change, of growth, of being better than the wolves who came before us." Sentiment. Darius practically spat the word. "The Alpha King is supposed to protect the pack, not coddle our enemies." "She's not your enemy." The words burst out of Kellen with barely controlled fury. "She's a girl who was orphaned at 5 years old, who spent her childhood running from hunters, who accepted a curse just to survive. She's worked in my household for years without incident, without complaint, without giving anyone reason to fear her. And you want to execute her for the crime of existing?" "Yes." Theron said it simply, without heat. "Because she is Silvermoon. Because her bloodline represents a threat to everything we've built. Because mercy to her is betrayal to every wolf who died defending the Alpha King system from her ancestors' attacks." Reina felt something cold settle in her chest. This was it. The moment she'd known was coming since Kellen had first spoken her name in this chamber. They were going to force him to choose her life or his crown, her freedom or his authority. And she couldn't let him sacrifice everything for her. "I'll go." Her voice came out quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. If it will prevent war, if it will satisfy the blood debt, I'll accept execution. She looked up at Kellen, saw the horror dawning in his eyes. Just promise me you'll keep looking for a real solution. For a way to fix what's broken before it tears everything apart. No, Kellen's voice was raw. Absolutely not. Your Majesty. She squeezed his hand, trying to make him understand. This is bigger than me. Bigger than both of us. If my death prevents civil war, your death fixes nothing. He turned to face her fully, and his eyes were pure amber now, his wolf too close to the surface. Don't you understand? The prophecy requires your freedom, not your execution. Killing you would only accelerate the collapse, not prevent it. Then we're doomed either way. She heard her voice crack. Because they'll never agree to free me. You heard them. Then I'll do it without their agreement. Kellen turned back to the council, his expression hard as stone. As Alpha King, I have the authority to issue pardons. To overturn previous rulings when new evidence comes to light. I'm invoking that authority now. The curse on Reina of the Silver Moon line is hereby broken. The blood debt is forgiven. She is free. The chamber exploded into chaos. Council members were shouting, some lunging to their feet, and Reina felt the temperature spike as wolves' tempers flared toward violence. She saw Garrick's eyes flash amber. Saw Darius's hands curl into claws. Saw Theron smile coldly. Then you've just declared yourself no longer fit to rule. The elder's voice carried despite the noise, and slowly the other council members fell silent. By overriding the council's authority without consultation, by placing your personal desires above pack welfare, by harboring an enemy of the state, you've violated the compact that grants you power. Kellen's face had gone white. That's not. Challenge. Theron stood, his ancient body suddenly looking far more dangerous than it had moments before. I, Theron of the Northern Pack, acting on behalf of this council, formally challenge Kellen's right to rule. To be decided by combat, as is traditional. Do you accept? The words hung in the air like a death sentence. If Kellen refused the challenge, he would be seen as weak, unworthy of his position. The council would vote to remove him, possibly imprison him. And Reina would be executed within hours. If he accepted, he would have to fight Theron, an elder who'd survived for over 2 centuries by being stronger, faster, and more ruthless than anyone who'd challenged him. And even if Kellen won, the council would still be against him. The political damage would be catastrophic. There was no good choice. Reina felt the room spinning. This was her fault. She should have stayed hidden, should have never gone to the temple that night, should have let Kellen continue believing she was just another servant. Instead, she'd exposed herself, exposed him, and now they were both going to pay for it. I accept. Kellen's voice was steady, but she could feel him trembling where their hands were still joined. Dawn tomorrow. The traditional grounds. Theron's smile widened. Excellent. I look forward to teaching you the consequences of sentiment, Your Majesty. The elder turned and walked from the chamber, and slowly the other council members followed, some looking satisfied, others troubled, but none willing to speak against what had just happened. Within minutes, the chamber was empty except for Kellen and Reina and the weight of everything they'd just lost. Reina pulled her hand from his and took a step back. You shouldn't have done that. I know. Kellen's voice was hollow. He's going to kill you. Probably. This is my fault. Stop. He moved toward her, caught her shoulders. None of this is your fault. The council was always going to react this way, I knew that going in. I gambled and I lost. Then why did you do it? Tears were burning behind her eyes now. Why sacrifice everything? Because it was right. He pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her, and she felt him shaking. Because you deserved freedom. Because the curse was wrong and someone needed to say so, even if it cost them everything. Reina buried her face in his chest and let the tears fall. I don't want you to die for me. I don't want to die at all. His laugh was shaky. But if I do, if Theron wins tomorrow, promise me you'll run. Get as far from the territories as you can before the council comes for you. I'm cursed, remember? I can't leave. I broke the curse. Officially. It might not hold once I'm dead, but you have to try. His arms tightened around her. Promise me, Reina. She wanted to promise. Wanted to lie and tell him she'd run. She'd save herself. She'd find a way to survive without him. But standing here in his arms, feeling his heart beat against hers, she knew the truth. If he died tomorrow, she wouldn't run. She'd make sure the council paid for it. Every single one of them. When the world demands you choose between power and love, between duty and justice, what do you sacrifice? Find out what happens when everything burns. Keep going with Shayla's romance library. Kellen didn't let her go back to the servants' quarters that night. Instead, he led her through a series of passages she'd never walked before, not the public corridors where nobles and guards moved freely, but the hidden veins of the fortress that only the royal family knew about. Secret ways built into the walls themselves, designed for escape or privacy or moments when an alpha king needed to move unseen through his own home. They emerged in a room that took Reina's breath away. It wasn't large, not by the standards of the fortress, where great halls stretched for hundreds of feet and ballrooms could hold entire packs. But it was beautiful in a way that felt almost sacred. Stone walls curved into a dome overhead, and every surface was covered in carvings, wolves running beneath crescent moons, forests rendered in such detail she could almost hear wind rustling through the leaves. Stars mapped across the ceiling in constellations she recognized from childhood stories. A silver moon room. This was part of the original temple. Kellen's voice was quiet behind her. Before my grandfather built the fortress. He incorporated some of the old structures into the new building, either because he was too lazy to tear them down completely or because some part of him recognized that destroying everything would be. He paused. I don't know. Wrong, maybe? This room was hidden behind a false wall. I found it when I was 12, exploring where I shouldn't have been. Reina turned slowly, taking it all in. There was a fireplace already burning. Kellen must have lit it before coming to find her, and the light danced across the carved walls, making the wolves seem to move. A bed stood against one wall, covered in furs and blankets that looked soft enough to sink into. A table near the fire held bread, cheese, wine. Simple food, but more than she usually ate in a week. You've been bringing supplies here. It wasn't a question. For the last 3 days. Kellen moved to the fireplace, adding another log though the fire was already burning hot. I thought, if things went badly with the council, I wanted somewhere safe to bring you. Somewhere they wouldn't think to look. They'll search the entire fortress. They'll search the parts of the fortress they know about. He straightened, turning to face her. This room isn't on any map. Isn't in any records that survived my grandfather's purges. As far as the current council knows, it doesn't exist. Reina wanted to argue. Wanted to point out that hidden rooms only stayed hidden until someone found them, and the council had centuries of experience hunting Silvermoon survivors. But Kellen was looking at her with an expression that made words dry up in her throat. He looked exhausted. Haunted. Like a man who'd just gambled everything he had and watched it burn. Sit. She moved to the table, pulling out one of the chairs. You need to eat something. I'm not hungry. Sit anyway. When he hesitated, she let a thread of command enter her voice, not alpha authority, but something older. The tone her mother had used when Reina was small and stubborn. Please. He sat. And Reina found herself moving through motions that felt strangely familiar, pouring wine and setting out food, creating small rituals of care that she barely remembered learning. Her mother had done this for her father, she realized. Had made sure he ate after difficult days, had tended to him in ways that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with love. The memory made her chest ache. She set a plate in front of Kellen, then took the seat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Just sat there in the firelight, in a room that had been built by her ancestors and hidden by his, and tried to process everything that had shattered in the space of a single council meeting. "Tell me about Theron." Reina's voice came out quieter than she'd intended. "How old is he?" "Old." Kellen picked at the bread on his plate. "He was already an elder when my grandfather took the crown. Some say he's over 300 years old, though I don't know if that's true or legend. What I do know is that he's survived 5 different Alpha Kings, outlasted dozens of challengers, and has more political power than any other council member. And he's never challenged for the crown himself? He doesn't want the crown." Kellen's mouth twisted. "He wants to be the one who controls whoever wears it. An Alpha King can be removed, but a council elder who plays things carefully can remain in power for centuries." He finally took a bite of bread, chewing mechanically. "My father hated him. Said Theron was a relic from a darker age, someone who'd forgotten how to adapt. But he was too valuable to eliminate, too connected, too knowledgeable. So my father kept him close and tried to limit his influence. And now he's going to kill you to keep that influence." Reina's voice was flat. "Now he's going to try." Kellen set down the bread. "I might surprise him." "Kellen." "I know." He held up a hand, cutting off her protest. "I know the odds. Theron has centuries of experience and power I can't match. But I'm faster than he is. Younger. And I'm fighting for something that matters to me, which gives me an advantage he doesn't have." "What advantage?" "Desperation. Love." The word hung in the air between them like a struck bell. Reina felt her breath catch. "You don't love me. You barely know me." "I've known you for over 2 years." Kellen leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I've watched you navigate a hostile environment with grace. Watched you be kind when you had every reason to be bitter. Watched you keep hoping even when hope was all you had left. And then I followed you to a ruined temple and saw you shine with power that made the moon itself take notice." He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. "Maybe I don't know your favorite food or what you like to do on quiet afternoons. But I know who you are, Reina. I know your strength and your resilience and your capacity for forgiveness even when you have every right to hate. And his voice roughened. I love all of that. I love you." Tears blurred her vision. "You're going to die tomorrow." "Probably not tomorrow." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "The challenge is at dawn. I've got at least 12 hours. This isn't funny." "I know." The smile faded. "But if I let myself think too hard about what's coming, I'll lose my mind. So I'm choosing to spend whatever time I have left with you in a room my ancestors stole from yours, eating bread and trying to memorize the way firelight catches in your hair." Reina stood abruptly, the chair scraping against stone. She couldn't sit still anymore, couldn't just accept that in 12 hours the man across from her might be dead and it would be her fault. She paced to the carved walls, ran her fingers over stone wolves frozen mid-leap, and tried to think of something, anything, that would change the trajectory they were on. "There has to be another way." Her voice sounded desperate even to her own ears. "Some loophole in pack law, some tradition we can invoke." "I've thought of everything." Kellen's voice was gentle behind her. "So has every legal scholar in the territories, probably. Challenges can only be withdrawn if both parties agree, and Theron will never agree. The fight is to submission or death, and Theron won't accept my submission. He needs me dead to make his point. And interfering with a formal challenge is grounds for immediate execution. So we just, what? Wait for dawn and hope you get lucky." "We wait for dawn." He was closer now, she could feel him behind her, close enough to touch, but not quite touching. "And I fight with everything I have. And whatever happens, at least I'll know I did the right thing. Even if it costs me everything." Reina spun to face him, anger and fear and grief all tangled together in her chest. "The right thing? You're going to die for a principle, Kellen. For a girl you barely know. How is that right? Because you're not just a principal." His hands came up to cup her face, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You're a person who deserved justice and never got it. a person who's been surviving on scraps of hope for 18 years. And if I can give you even one day of freedom before, his voice caught. Before whatever happens tomorrow, then it's worth it. Not to me. The words came out broken. Not if it means losing you. Reina. I mean it. She grabbed his wrists, holding his hands against her face. I've lost everyone I ever cared about. Everyone. And I've made peace with that. I've accepted that I'm alone, that I'll always be alone, that the curse means I'll never have pack or family or anything that looks like a normal life. But then you, her voice cracked. You had to go and follow me to that temple. Had to see me and still think I was worth saving. Had to make me hope again when hope is the most dangerous thing I could possibly feel. I'm sorry. His forehead came to rest against hers. I'm sorry I made things harder. I'm not finished. She tightened her grip on his wrists. You made me hope. Made me want things I thought I'd given up on. Made me feel like maybe I could have something that looked like happiness. And now you're going to take all of that away by getting yourself killed in some stupid challenge that never should have happened. She was crying openly now, past caring about dignity or strength or maintaining any kind of composure. So no, this isn't right. This isn't fair. And I hate you a little bit for making me care right before you're going to leave. Kellen made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I hate me for that too. Good. She released his wrists and wrapped her arms around his neck instead, pulling him down into a fierce hug. We should both hate you. It's only fair. His arms came around her waist, holding her tight enough that she could barely breathe, and for a long moment they just stood there. Two people who should have been enemies, clinging to each other like drowning victims, while fire crackled and shadows danced, and the carved wolves on the walls watched with patient stone eyes. Dance with me. Kellen's voice was rough against her hair. Reina pulled back far enough to look at him. What? Dance with me. He was already moving, pulling her toward the open space in front of the fire. There's no music, but I don't care. He stopped, jaw working. I want one good memory. Something that's just ours. Something that has nothing to do with curses or councils or prophecies that might get us killed. I don't know how to dance. The admission came out embarrassed. No one ever taught me. Then we'll make it up as we go. He positioned her hands, one on his shoulder, one clasped in his, and placed his free hand at her waist. Just follow my lead. And if I step on your feet, feel free to step on mine back. They moved slowly at first, swaying more than dancing, finding a rhythm that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with the way their hearts were beating in sync. Kellen hummed something low and wordless, and gradually Reina felt herself relaxing into the movement. Into him. This was insane. They should be planning. Strategizing. Finding some impossible solution to an impossible situation. Not dancing in a hidden room like they had all the time in the world. But Kellen had asked for one good memory, and Reina found she couldn't deny him that. Couldn't deny either of them, really. Because tomorrow he might be dead and she might be executed and the entire territory might be spiraling toward the chaos the prophecy had predicted. But tonight, right now, in this moment, they were alive and together and swaying in firelight while the world outside continued spinning without them. Tell me something. Kellen's voice was soft near her ear. Something I don't know. Something real. Reina thought for a moment, sifting through memories she usually kept locked tight. My mother used to sing when she braided my hair. Old songs in the old language. I didn't understand most of the words, but I loved the sound of her voice. She had this way of making everything feel sacred, even small things like preparing for bed or getting ready in the morning. She paused, the memory sharp enough to hurt. I can't remember her face anymore. Not clearly. But I still remember her voice. Kellen's arms tightened around her. I'm sorry you lost that. Tell me something now. She pulled back enough to see his face. Something real. He was quiet for a long moment, still moving slowly in their improvised dance. My father died when I was 22. An ambush during what was supposed to be a simple border inspection. They never caught everyone responsible. Some of the conspirators escaped into neutral territories. His jaw tightened. I was crowned 3 days after his funeral. Barely old enough to know what I was doing, surrounded by council members who saw me as weak. Controllable. I've spent the last 5 years trying to prove them wrong. Trying to be strong enough, decisive enough, ruthless enough to earn their respect. And now you're throwing it all away for me. Reina's voice was barely a whisper. No, he stopped moving, cupping her face again. Now I'm finally doing something that matters. Something that's not about political strategy or maintaining power or playing games with people who care more about influence than justice. His eyes were fierce. I'm doing what my father would have wanted. What I should have done the moment I found you in my household and realized what you were. Your father would have wanted you to survive. My father would have wanted me to stand for something worth dying for. Kellen's thumb traced her cheekbone. He told me once, right before he left on that final trip, that power without purpose is just tyranny with better decorations. That an alpha king who only cares about keeping his crown isn't worth following. He smiled, but it was sad. I think he'd be proud of me. Finally. Reina felt fresh tears threatening. I wish I could have met him. He would have liked you. Kellen's voice was warm with certainty. Would have seen the strength in you immediately. Probably would have freed you himself if he'd known you existed. They stood there for a moment, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other's air. And then Reina did something she'd sworn she'd never do, something that went against every survival instinct she'd honed over 18 years. She chose to be vulnerable. I don't want to be alone again. The words came out small, almost childlike. I know that's selfish. I know you're facing death tomorrow and I should be stronger, should be able to handle whatever happens. But the truth is her voice broke. The truth is I've been alone for so long, and these past few days with you have been the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere. Like I mattered to someone. And the thought of going back to that loneliness, of watching you die and knowing I'll never have this again, she couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't force the words past the grief closing her throat. Hey, Kellen tilted her chin up gently. Look at me. She did, and saw her own pain reflected in his eyes. You matter, he said fiercely. To me, yes, but also to the world. You're the last of your line, Reina. The only person alive who can fulfill the prophecy and maybe, set things right. You matter more than I do, more than the council does, more than any of us. And if I die tomorrow, he stopped, swallowed hard. If I die tomorrow, you need to promise me you won't give up. That you'll keep fighting. Keep surviving. Keep being exactly who you are, because the territories need you even if they don't know it yet. I can't promise that. The admission was raw. I don't know how to keep going without. She gestured helplessly between them. Without this. Without you. Yes, you can. His voice was gentle, but absolutely certain. You're the girl who survived a massacre at 5 years old. Who lived alone in the wilderness for years when most adults would have died in weeks. Who accepted a curse just to have a chance at life, and then spent 6 years in servitude without letting it break you. You're stronger than you think, Reina. Stronger than I'll ever be. That's not true. It is. He kissed her forehead, soft and reverent. I'm strong because I was raised to be. Trained and educated and given every advantage. But you, his voice roughened with emotion. You're strong because you had to be. Because you chose to be every single day, even when it would have been easier to give up. That's real strength. That's the kind of strength that can change the world. Reina wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was barely holding herself together most days, that the strength he saw was just stubbornness dressed up as courage. But the way he was looking at her, with absolute faith, absolute conviction, made the protests die in her throat. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was stronger than she believed. Or maybe he just needed to believe it because the alternative was leaving her completely alone in a world that wanted her dead. Either way, she found herself nodding. Okay, I'll keep going. The words felt like a vow. If tomorrow, if the worst happens, I'll survive. I'll find a way to fulfill the prophecy, or at least make sure your death meant something. I promise. Relief washed over Kellen's face, so profound it made him look younger. Thank you. They stood there for another long moment, just holding each other, while the fire burned low and the night deepened outside. And then, because they were both exhausted and terrified and desperately trying not to think about Dawn, they moved to the bed. Not for anything physical, neither of them had the energy or the heart for that kind of intimacy. But for comfort. For the simple human need to not be alone when darkness felt overwhelming. They lay down together, still mostly clothed, and Kellen pulled the furs over them both. Reina tucked herself against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, trying to memorize the sound. His arms came around her, solid and warm, and she felt safer than she had since she was 5 years old and her mother used to sing her to sleep. Reina? Kellen's voice was drowsy. If I win tomorrow, if by some miracle I actually survive, will you let me court you properly? The way you deserve. She felt her lips curve despite everything. Court me? Like with flowers and formal declarations. Exactly like that. She could hear the smile in his voice. I want to take you to dinner in the Great Hall, where everyone can see. Want to walk with you through the gardens and hold your hand where the whole fortress can witness it. Want to, he paused. Want to give you all the things you should have had if the world weren't so broken. Tears burned behind Reina's closed eyes, but for once they weren't entirely sad. Yes. If you win tomorrow, you can court me properly. Good. His arms tightened around her. That's something to fight for, then. Something beyond duty or prophecy or politics. Just us. Building something that's ours. Just us, Reina echoed, and let herself believe, just for tonight, that such a thing was possible. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other in a room built by her ancestors and hidden by his, while carved stone wolves watched over them and firelight slowly faded to embers. And if both of them had nightmares about what dawn would bring, neither of them spoke of it. They just held each other tighter and tried to make the night last as long as possible. Because some things were too precious to waste on words. Some things could only be felt. Dawn came too quickly. Reina woke to find Kellen already up, standing by the small window that looked out over the eastern mountains. The first light of morning was just beginning to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that reminded her too much of his eyes. He was dressed for combat, leather pants and a sleeveless tunic that would allow freedom of movement, boots laced tight, his hair pulled back from his face. He looked every inch the warrior alpha, all lean muscle and coiled power. But his hands were trembling slightly as he adjusted his bracers. Reina sat up, and the movement caught his attention. He turned, and the expression on his face made her chest ache. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. The look of a man walking toward his own execution and trying to pretend he wasn't terrified. You should stay here. His voice was rough, like he'd been awake for hours. The challenge will be held in the old arena. It'll be violent. You don't need to see. I'm coming. She stood, wrapping one of the furs around her shoulders. If you think I'm going to hide in here while you fight for your life, you're insane. Reina. I'm coming, she repeated and put enough steel in her voice that he stopped arguing. The truth was, she couldn't have stayed away if she'd wanted to. The bond between them, still new, still fragile, but growing stronger every hour, was pulling her toward him like a physical tether. The thought of being separated while he walked into danger made her skin crawl, made her wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin, demanding she stay close to her mate. Kellen studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Stay in the upper gallery. Don't come down to the arena floor no matter what happens. And if he stopped jaw working. If things go badly, run. Don't wait. Don't try to fight. Just run as far and as fast as you can. Kellen, promise me. His eyes were fierce. This is the only thing I'm going to ask of you today. Promise me you'll save yourself if I fall. Reina wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell him that if he died, she'd make sure every council member paid for it in blood and fire, and the kind of vengeance that would make the old stories look tame. But the desperation in his eyes stopped her. "I promise," she lied, and hated herself for it. They left the hidden room together, moving through passages that were already beginning to fill with early morning light. The fortress was waking. Reina could hear distant voices, the clatter of servants beginning their morning routines, guards changing shifts. Normal sounds on a morning that felt anything but normal. As they approached the arena, the sounds changed. Voices grew louder, more numerous. By the time they reached the corridor that led to the upper gallery, Reina could hear a crowd gathering. Of course, a challenge to the Alpha King's authority wasn't something that happened quietly. Everyone would want to witness it. Everyone would want to see which wolf walked away. Kellen stopped at the entrance to the gallery, turning to face her one last time. For a moment, he just looked at her, really looked, like he was trying to memorize every detail. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, hard and desperate and achingly brief. "Whatever happens," he said against her lips, "you are worth it. All of it. Don't ever doubt that." Before she could respond, he was gone, striding down the corridor toward the arena floor with his shoulders back and his head high. Every inch the Alpha King, walking toward a fight he might not win. Reina watched until he disappeared around a corner, then forced herself to move toward the gallery entrance. She could hear the crowd now, hundreds of voices, creating a dull roar that made her stomach clench. She pushed through the doorway and immediately wished she hadn't. The arena was packed. It was an ancient space, carved directly into the mountain stone beneath the fortress, circular, with steep walls that rose up to a gallery where spectators could watch without being in danger. The floor was bare earth, stained dark in places where blood had soaked in over centuries of challenges and executions, and the kind of violence that defined wolf politics. Kellen stood in the center, flanked by two guards who were checking his gear according to challenge protocol. No hidden weapons, no armor beyond leather, nothing that would give an unfair advantage. He submitted to the inspection with calm dignity, but Reina could see the tension in his shoulders. Across from him, Theron was also being inspected. The elder looked far less human than he had in the council chamber. His eyes were fully amber, his movements predatory, and there was something ancient and terrible about the way he carried himself. Like a creature that had survived for centuries by being the most dangerous thing in any room. The gallery was filled with wolves from every major pack in the territories. Nobles and guards, servants pressed against the back walls, even children perched on parents' shoulders to get a better view. Reina found a space near the railing, trying to make herself small and invisible. A few people glanced her way, but most were too focused on the arena floor to pay attention to one more servant. A horn sounded, cutting through the noise, and silence fell like a blade. An elder Reina didn't recognize stepped forward, not Theron, but another council member who would serve as arbiter. His voice carried through the arena with the kind of projection that came from decades of practice. "A challenge has been issued. Theron of the Northern Pack, acting on behalf of the council, challenges Kellen's right to rule. The grounds, abuse of authority, harboring enemies of the state, placing personal interests above pack welfare." He paused, looking between the two combatants. "Do both parties acknowledge the challenge?" "I do." Theron's voice was cold. "I do." Kellen's was steady. "Then let it be known, this challenge will be decided by combat. To submission or death, as is traditional. The victor's authority is absolute, no appeals, no reversals, no mercy. Do both parties understand?" "I do," they said in unison. The arbiter stepped back. "Then begin." For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The two wolves just stared at each other across the blood-stained earth, neither willing to make the first move. Then Theron smiled, cold and cruel, and the fight exploded into motion. He moved faster than anything that old should be able to move, crossing the distance between them in a blur and slamming into Kellen with enough force to send them both tumbling across the arena floor. They rolled, a tangle of limbs and snarls, each trying to gain the upper hand. Kellen got his feet under him first, pushing away and creating distance. Blood already stained his tunic. Theron's claws had opened 3 long gashes across his ribs. Not deep enough to be immediately fatal, but enough to hurt. Enough to slow him down. Too slow, boy. Theron circled, his movements eerily fluid. Your father was faster. Not fast enough to save him, but faster than you. The words were designed to provoke, to make Kellen angry and reckless. But he didn't rise to the bait. Just adjusted his stance, watching Theron with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of training. They clashed again, and this time Kellen was ready. He ducked under Theron's first strike and landed a solid hit to the elder's ribs, hard enough that Reina heard bone crack even from the gallery. But Theron barely flinched. Just spun and caught Kellen across the face with a backhand that sent him staggering. Blood poured from Kellen's nose. He spat, clearing his mouth, and Reina saw his teeth were stained red. Yield, Theron said, almost conversational. Yield now, and I'll make it quick. No, Kellen wiped blood from his face. Not until you're dead or I am. So be it. The fight devolved into something brutal and primal. They traded blows that would have killed a human, each strike landing with sounds like meat hitting stone. Kellen was faster, but Theron was stronger and had centuries of experience reading opponents. Every time Kellen thought he'd found an opening, Theron was already moving to counter. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Reina's hands were white-knuckled on the gallery railing, and she could taste blood where she'd bitten through her lip without noticing. Around her, the crowd was silent except for occasional gasps when a particularly vicious blow landed. Kellen was tiring. She could see it in the way his movements were slowing fractionally, in how his blocks were a split second late. The wounds Theron had opened were bleeding steadily, not enough to be immediately life-threatening, but enough to weaken him. And Theron knew it. Was targeting those injuries deliberately, opening them wider, making Kellen bleed faster. Your maid is watching. Theron's voice carried to the gallery. The little silver moon whore you thought was worth dying for. What do you think she'll do when you're dead? Do you think the council will let her walk away? Kellen's response was a snarl and a strike that Theron blocked easily. We'll execute her slowly, Theron continued, circling. Make an example of what happens to enemies of the state. Maybe we'll burn her, the way we burned her temple. Full circle, don't you think? Shut up. Kellen's voice was raw with fury, and Reina saw what Theron was doing, goading him, making him emotional, breaking his focus. It was working. Kellen lunged, fast but reckless, and Theron sidestepped easily. His claws raked across Kellen's back as he passed, opening wounds deep enough that Reina could see white bone beneath red meat. Kellen went down hard, crashing face-first into the blood-stained earth. No! The scream tore out of Reina before she could stop it. Around her, heads turned, but she didn't care. Couldn't care. All she could see was Kellen struggling to push himself up, blood pouring from too many wounds, while Theron stood over him like death incarnate. Yield. Theron's voice was almost bored now. No, Kellen got one knee under himself, then the other. Somehow, impossibly, he stood. His legs were shaking, and he was swaying like a tree in a high wind, but he stood. Not until. Theron struck again, claws aimed for Kellen's throat. And Kellen, with the last of his strength, dropped and rolled, coming up inside Theron's guard and driving his fist up under the elder's ribs with enough force to lift him off his feet. Theron staggered back, and for the first time, genuine surprise crossed his face. Kellen followed up, pressing his advantage despite the blood loss making his movements sluggish. He landed 3 more hits, each one solid, each one driving Theron back toward the arena wall. The crowd was roaring now, sensing an upset, and Reina felt hope flare painfully bright in her chest. He might win. Against all odds, He might actually win. Then Theron smiled. Well done, the elder said, and his voice was wrong, layered with something that made Reina's skin crawl. You've earned this. He moved faster than he'd been moving before, faster than should have been possible, and his hand shot out, catching Kellen by the throat. And squeezed. Kellen's eyes went wide. His hands came up, clawing at Theron's wrist, but the elder's grip was like iron. Like stone. Kellen's face was turning purple, his legs kicking uselessly as Theron lifted him off the ground with one hand. Did you really think, Theron said quietly, that I would let some boy undo centuries of careful work? That I would let a Silvermoon heir live, just because you developed sentimental feelings? He was using dark magic. Reina could see it now, the shadows gathering around Theron's arm, lending him strength that came from something other than wolf nature. Forbidden magic, the kind that required blood sacrifice and corrupted everything it touched. The kind of magic that had been banned for 300 years. Kellen was dying. Reina could see consciousness fading from his eyes, could see his struggles weakening. In seconds, it would be over. And something inside her snapped. The pendant at her throat, the one that held her curse, suddenly burned white-hot. She gasped, hands flying to her neck, and felt the metal crack. Split. Fall away in pieces that dissolved to ash before they hit the ground. The curse broke. And with it, the locks she'd kept on her power for 6 years shattered like glass. Magic erupted out of her in a wave that made the entire arena shake. Silverfire, the blessing of the Silvermoon line, the gift that had made her ancestors priests and prophets, exploded from her skin in tongues of flame that didn't burn but blazed with the cold light of the moon itself. Every wolf in the arena felt it. Reina saw them flinch back, saw alphas drop to one knee without meaning to, saw children cry out and hide their faces against their parents. The power was overwhelming, vast, the accumulated legacy of a bloodline that had served the goddess for 1,000 years. And it was focused entirely on the man who was killing her mate. Let him go. Her voice carried through the arena like thunder, layered with harmonics that came from somewhere beyond human speech. The voice of prophecy. The voice of divine wrath given mortal form. Theron turned to stare at her, and for the first time, she saw fear in his ancient eyes. His grip loosened. Kellen dropped, collapsing to the ground and gasping for air. And Reina vaulted over the gallery railing. She fell 30 feet and landed on the arena floor in a crouch, silver fire still pouring off her skin. The earth beneath her feet cracked, spider-webbing outward from where she'd struck, and when she stood, she felt 12 feet tall. Felt powerful in a way she'd never allowed herself to feel before. Felt like the goddess herself had reached down and said, "Enough. You." She pointed at Theron, and her hand was wreathed in flames that cast no smoke. "You dare use blood magic. You dare corrupt wolf nature with shadow arts. You dare," her voice rose to something that made the stone walls shake. "You dare lay hands on the moon's chosen?" Theron's face had gone white. "The moon has no chosen," the Silvermoon line was. "Lies." The word crashed through the arena like a physical force, and half the crowd cried out. "You knew. You've always known. The prophecy was real, the blessing was real, and you spent 3 centuries trying to bury the truth because you were terrified of losing your power." She started walking toward him, and Theron backed up. Actually backed away from a girl he dismissed as weak. As inconsequential. "The massacre," Reina continued, her voice dropping to something cold and terrible. "It wasn't about justice. It wasn't about protecting the Alpha King system. It was about you, Theron. You convinced my grandfather to attack my people because our priestesses saw what you really were. What you'd done to gain your power. What you'd sacrificed to live so long. You don't know what you're talking about. Blood magic." She let the words hang in the air. "Forbidden rituals that require the death of innocents. That's how you've survived for 300 years, isn't it? That's why you pushed for the massacre, not to protect wolves, but to create enough death to fuel your next century of life." The crowd was murmuring now, voices rising in confusion and growing horror. Even the other council members were staring at Theron with expressions that ranged from shock to dawning realization. Prove it. Theron's voice was steady, but Reina could see sweat beading on his forehead. You have no proof. Don't I? Reina raised her hand, and the silver fire gathered in her palm, condensing into a sphere of pure light. The moon sees everything, Theron. Every crime. Every victim. Every drop of innocent blood spilled to feed your ambition. She threw the sphere, not at Theron, but at the ground between them. It struck the earth and exploded outward, not in heat or flame, but in images, projections of memory pulled from the blood-soaked soil of the arena itself. The crowd gasped. They were seeing murders. Rituals performed in darkness. Innocents, children, mostly bound and sacrificed, while Theron carved runes into their skin and drank their life force to extend his own. Dozens of victims over centuries, all carefully hidden, all explained away as accidents or disappearances, or the inevitable casualties of wolf politics. All of it laid bare under the merciless light of divine truth. No, Theron's voice was barely a whisper. No, you can't. This isn't. This is justice. Reina's voice was cold as winter stone. This is what you were so desperate to prevent. Why you wanted my entire line destroyed. Because you knew that eventually, one of us would survive. Would grow strong. Would stand before the people you've manipulated for centuries and reveal exactly what you are. She looked up at the crowd, at the council members standing frozen in the gallery. He used you, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the arena. Used your fear, your ambition, your loyalty to the pack system. Convinced you that my people were the threat when all along, he was the rot at the heart of everything. The reason the territories are destabilizing. The reason packs are tearing themselves apart. Because his magic corrupts everything it touches, and he's been feeding on your pack bonds for centuries. Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. Then, from the gallery, is this true? Garrick. The alpha who'd been Theron's strongest supporter. He was staring at the elder with an expression of complete betrayal. Theron opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in 300 years, he had no explanation. No justification. No clever political maneuvering that would let him escape consequences. He was caught. And he knew it. Kill her. The command burst from him with the force of alpha authority amplified by dark magic. She's Silvermoon. She's the enemy. Kill her now. But no one moved. Because the truth was laid bare for all to see, and not even an elder's command could override what every wolf in the arena now knew. Theron was the monster. Not Reina. The elder's face twisted with rage and fear. His form began to shift, not into a wolf, but into something wrong. Something that shouldn't exist. Shadow and meat and ancient hunger given shape, fueled by centuries of stolen lives. If I'm going to fall, he snarled, his voice distorting as the transformation took him, I'm taking you with me. He lunged. And Reina, last of the Silvermoon line, blessed of the moon, raised her hands and spoke the words her mother had taught her 18 years ago. The prayer that had been passed down through 1,000 years of priestesses. The words of binding. Silver fire erupted from her palms, not the controlled flames she'd been using, but a torrent of divine power that lit up the entire arena like the sun had fallen to earth. It struck Theron mid-lunge and wrapped around him like chains, burning away the shadow corruption and revealing what lay beneath. A withered thing. Ancient and used up. Held together by stolen life and dark magic and 3 centuries of accumulated sins. The moon judges you, Reina said, and her voice was layered with others, the voices of every Silvermoon priestess who'd come before her. And finds you wanting. The fire consumed him. Not quickly, but thoroughly, burning away every trace of the corruption he'd spread, every ritual he'd performed, every innocent life he'd stolen. He screamed, and it sounded like 1,000 voices screaming with him, all the victims finally given voice. And then he was ash. Just ash, scattering across the blood-stained arena floor like it had never been more than dust. Reina stood in the center of the destruction, silver fire still dancing across her skin, and the entire arena fell to their knees. Not in worship. In recognition. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The false king or false elder, in this case, had been judged. And the last of the Silver Moon line had risen to speak truth to power. Reina let the fire fade slowly, feeling the exhaustion hit her all at once. Her legs were shaking, and she would have fallen if strong hands hadn't caught her from behind. Kellen, battered and bleeding but alive, his arms wrapping around her waist and holding her upright. "I've got you," he whispered against her hair. "I've got you." She leaned back against him, feeling his heart beating against her spine, and knew that everything had changed. The curse was broken. The truth was revealed. And nothing would ever be the same again. The arena had become a cathedral of silence. Reina stood at its center, Kellen's arms still wrapped around her waist, holding her upright as exhaustion tried to drag her down. Silver fire flickered across her skin in dying embers, fading like stars at dawn, but the power still hummed beneath her bones, vast and ancient and no longer willing to be contained. Around them, wolves knelt. Not just the crowd in the gallery, but the council members who'd condemned her, the guards who'd have executed her without question, the nobles who'd whispered about the cursed maid who kept her head too low and her scent too hidden. All of them on their knees, heads bowed, as though she were something sacred instead of something they'd wanted dead. She could feel their fear, their awe, their confusion as centuries of carefully constructed lies crumbled to ash around them. Theron was gone. The elder who'd manipulated pack politics for 300 years, who'd orchestrated genocide and called it justice, who'd fed on innocent lives to extend his own, reduced to nothing more than dust scattering across blood-stained earth. The dark magic he'd woven into the very fabric of the territories was burning away, leaving behind a void that would take years to fill. Or maybe not a void. Maybe just space for something better to grow. Reina felt Kellen's grip tighten around her waist as her knees buckled. The power that had flooded through her was retreating now, sliding back beneath her skin like a tide going out, and it left her feeling hollowed. Scraped clean. Every nerve ending raw and exposed. "I've got you," Kellen whispered again, and she believed him. Felt the truth of it in the way his body curved around hers, protective and solid, despite the wounds Theron had opened across his ribs and back. Despite the blood still seeping through his torn tunic and the way his own hands were shaking with exhaustion. He was holding her up even though he could barely stand himself. That was what mates did, she realized. Held each other when the world tried to tear them apart. Stood together when standing alone would have been easier. Chose each other over and over, even when the cost was everything. A sound broke the silence, footsteps echoing across the arena floor. Reina lifted her head, blinking through the haze of exhaustion, and saw Garrick approaching. The alpha who'd been Theron's strongest supporter, who'd argued most vehemently for her execution, now moved with the careful hesitation of someone approaching something wild and dangerous. Something that might bite. He stopped 10 feet away and dropped to one knee, head bowed so deeply his forehead nearly touched the ground. When he spoke, his voice carried through the arena with the kind of projection that came from decades of commanding packs. "Forgive us." The words were rough, scraped raw with emotion Reina couldn't quite parse. "We were blind. Manipulated. Led astray by lies we should have questioned centuries ago." He lifted his head just enough to meet her eyes, and what she saw there wasn't anger or resentment. Just bone-deep shame. Your people were innocent. The massacre was unjust. And the curse placed on you, his voice cracked. It was cruelty masquerading as law. We beg your forgiveness. Reina stared at him. At the alpha who'd called her a threat not an hour ago. Who'd demanded her immediate execution to protect the pack system. Now kneeling before her like a supplicant at an altar, asking for mercy he didn't deserve. Part of her, the part that still carried 18 years of grief and rage and helpless fury, wanted to refuse. Wanted to make him suffer the way her people had suffered. wanted to take everything from him the way everything had been taken from her. But standing here in Kellen's arms, feeling the bond between them pulse with warmth and certainty, she found that the rage had lost its sharp edges. Not disappeared, it would probably never completely disappear, but dulled. Transmuted into something that looked almost like understanding. Theron had used them all. Wolves like Garrick weren't evil, just deceived. Convinced that strength meant cruelty, that safety required sacrifice, that protecting the pack meant crushing anyone who threatened the established order. They'd been wrong. Catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. But they hadn't known. Not really. Not until Silverfire had burned away the lies and forced them to see what they'd become. Stand up. Reina's voice came out hoarse, scraped raw from channeling power that was never meant to move through mortal throats. All of you. Stand. Slowly, hesitantly, the wolves rose. First Garrick, then the other council members, then the guards and nobles and common pack members who'd filled the gallery to watch an Alpha King fall. They stood with heads still bowed, waiting for judgment from a girl they dismissed as nothing more than a servant. From the last priestess of a murdered bloodline. My people believed in balance. Reina heard herself speaking and wasn't entirely sure where the words were coming from. The goddess, maybe. Or the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of Silvermoon priestesses, rising through her like water through roots. They believed that wolves were meant to run in packs, yes, but also to honor the land that sustained them. To serve the moon that called them. To remember that power without purpose is just tyranny with better decorations. She felt Kellen tense behind her, recognizing his father's words coming from her mouth, but she kept going. The Alpha King system isn't inherently wrong. Centralizing authority can bring stability, can unite fractured packs, can prevent the kind of constant territorial warfare that would tear the territories apart. She paused, gathering strength. But it becomes wrong when that authority is used to suppress truth, to silence dissent, to erase entire bloodlines because they dared to question whether might makes right. Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. Theron corrupted everything he touched, Reina continued. Used your loyalty against you. Turned your strength into a weapon for his own advancement. Made you complicit in atrocities you would never have committed if you'd known the full truth. She looked around the arena, meeting as many eyes as she could. But now you know. Now the lies are burned away, and you have to choose what kind of wolves you want to be going forward. What would you have us do? It was Mira who spoke up, the elder from the Western Packs. Her voice was quiet, almost meek, a stark contrast to the sharp authority she'd wielded in the council chamber. How do we make this right? You can't. The words came out flat, factual. Nothing you do will bring back the people who died. Nothing will undo the curse I lived under for 6 years or the 18 years I spent running and hiding before that. The past is written in blood and bone, and it can't be rewritten no matter how much we might wish otherwise. She felt despair ripple through the crowd like a wave. Good. They should despair. Should feel the weight of what their predecessors had done, what they'd perpetuated through willful ignorance. But Reina continued and heard hope catch like a sparked flame. You can choose differently going forward. You can acknowledge that the Silvermoon line was wronged. That the massacre was genocide, not justice. That the prophecy my ancestors spoke was truth, not treason. She paused. And you can work to rebuild what was broken. To restore balance before the territories tear themselves apart completely. Garrick stepped forward, his expression carved from determination. Tell us how. Tell us what needs to change, and we'll do it. Whatever it takes. Reina wanted to laugh at the irony. Yesterday, this man had demanded her death. Today, he was offering to follow her guidance. The shift was dizzying, disorienting, like waking up in a world where all the rules had been rewritten overnight. But Kellen's arms tightened around her waist, grounding her, and she found her voice again. First, the curse laws need to be abolished. Not just mine, all of them. Blood debts enforced through binding magic are slavery by another name, and they have no place in a just society. Her voice was getting stronger now, more certain. Second, the official histories need to be corrected. My people weren't traitors. They were priests who saw a danger the rest of you were blind to, and they paid for that sight with their lives. Their memory deserves truth, not propaganda. Heads were nodding around the arena. Even the council members looked relieved to have clear direction, something concrete they could work toward. Third, Reina hesitated, because this part was harder. More personal. The territories need oversight. Not just an alpha king who rules by strength, but a council that actually checks that power. That asks hard questions. That remembers the past so history doesn't repeat itself. She glanced back at Kellen, saw understanding dawn in his amber eyes. The Silver Moon priestesses used to serve that function. We kept records, mediated disputes, spoke truth to power when power needed to hear it. That role needs to be restored. Not with me. She stopped the protest before it could form. Not yet, at least. But with someone. Maybe multiple someones. People who care more about balance than personal advancement. You. It was a young voice from the gallery, a girl who couldn't have been more than 15, eyes wide with something that looked like worship. You should do it. You're the last priestess. You have the power, you know the old ways. I'm exhausted. Reina cut through the rising murmur of agreement with brutal honesty. I've spent 6 years pretending to be someone I'm not, 18 years before that just trying to survive. I don't have the energy or the knowledge to rebuild an entire religious order from scratch. She met the girl's eyes. But I can teach. Can pass on what my mother taught me, what the old texts in Kellen's archive say. Can help train the next generation of wolves who'll serve as the pack's conscience. The murmuring grew louder, more animated. Reina could hear snatches of conversation, debates about implementation, logistics, who might be suited for such training. It sounded almost hopeful, like wolves who'd been trapped in a corrupt system finally glimpsing a way forward. But then another voice cut through the noise, cold and sharp as winter wind. And what about the prophecy? Reina's blood went cold. She knew that voice. Knew it from nightmares and half-remembered trauma and the 3 months she'd spent hiding in a root cellar while hunters searched for survivors. She turned and saw a woman standing at the entrance to the arena. Tall, silver-haired, with eyes like chips of ice and a bearing that screamed authority despite her advanced age. She wore robes that marked her as an elder, but not from any pack Reina recognized. An independent. Someone who owed allegiance to no alpha king, who moved between territories as she pleased, who wielded influence through knowledge and connection rather than political position. The woman who'd found Reina at 12 years old and offered her a choice between death and servitude. The woman who'd placed the curse around her neck and told her to be grateful. Elder Cassandra. Kellen's voice was carefully neutral, but Reina felt him tense behind her. I didn't realize you were in the capital. I arrived 3 days ago. Cassandra descended the arena steps with the kind of measured grace that came from centuries of practice. Word reached me that the Alpha King had discovered something interesting in his household. I came to witness for myself. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. And I'm so glad I did. Such drama. Such revelation. Theron's fall was particularly satisfying. I never liked the man. She reached the arena floor and began walking toward Reina with slow, deliberate steps. Like a wolf approaching prey that might still have teeth. But you never answered the question that's on everyone's mind, child. Cassandra's voice carried through the arena with practiced projection. The prophecy speaks of restoration, yes. Of balance regained. But it also speaks of a choice. She stopped 10 feet away, the same distance Garrick had maintained. The false king must release what was stolen, or watch his kingdom burn. Kellen has broken your curse, released you from servitude. But is that enough? Or does the prophecy demand something more? Reina felt her throat go tight. She'd been so focused on Theron, on exposing his corruption and surviving the immediate threat, that she hadn't thought through the full implications of the prophecy she'd supposedly fulfilled. Release what was stolen. She'd assumed that meant her freedom, her life, the justice her people had been denied. But what if it meant something bigger? Something that would require Kellen to give up more than just one cursed servant? What are you suggesting? Kellen's voice had gone hard, dangerous. His alpha authority leaked into the words, making several wolves in the gallery flinch. Cassandra's expression remained placid. I'm suggesting that the prophecy might not be satisfied with half measures. That releasing one girl from her curse, while commendable, doesn't address the systemic theft the prophecy refers to. She gestured around the arena. The Alpha Kings stole sovereignty from the individual packs, stole the right to self-governance, stole the balance that existed before power was centralized in one bloodline. Her eyes met Reina's. Perhaps the prophecy demands that theft be corrected, that the Alpha King system be dismantled entirely, returning us to the old ways. Pack rule instead of kingdom rule. The arena erupted. Half the wolves were shouting agreement. Yes, restore the old ways, give power back to the packs, end the tyranny of centralized authority. The other half were shouting opposition, chaos. That would be chaos. The territories would tear themselves apart without a strong ruler. And Reina stood frozen in the middle of it all, feeling the weight of expectation crash down on her shoulders like a physical force. This was what Cassandra had wanted all along, she realized with sudden, sickening clarity. Why she'd cursed a 12-year-old girl instead of killing her outright. Why she'd placed Reina specifically in the Alpha King's household, where she'd eventually be discovered. Why she'd shown up now at the moment of maximum dramatic impact. She'd been playing a game that spanned decades, using Reina as a chess piece to destabilize the system she'd apparently opposed all along. And now that Theron was dead and the lies were exposed, she was making her move. No. Reina's voice cut through the noise like a blade, and the arena fell silent. That's not what the prophecy demands. Cassandra's eyebrows rose fractionally. Oh? And how would you know? You're barely 20 years old, child. You've never read the full prophecy, never studied the original texts. I don't need to read texts to know what the goddess wants. Reina pulled away from Kellen's arms reluctantly, because leaving his warmth felt like stepping into winter, and moved to face Cassandra directly. I heard her voice. In the temple ruins, when I knelt at the altar and spoke the prayers my mother taught me. When the power answered and the moon itself took notice. She lifted her chin. The goddess doesn't want the system dismantled. She wants it fixed. There's a difference. Enlighten us. Cassandra's voice was dry. Reina took a breath, reaching for the certainty she'd felt when silver fire was pouring through her veins and divine truth was burning away lies. It was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be spoken. The Alpha King system became corrupt because there was no check on its power. No balance. No accountability. Theron manipulated that weakness for centuries, but he wasn't the weakness, he was the symptom. She looked around the arena, meeting as many eyes as she could. Dismantling the system entirely would solve nothing. Would just fragment the territories and guarantee constant warfare as packs fought for resources and territory. That's not balance, that's chaos. Then what is balance? Someone called from the gallery. Integration. The word came from somewhere deep, somewhere that felt like ancestral memory. The Alpha Kings rule, yes, but they're advised by priestesses who serve the goddess instead of political interests. Who keep records. Who mediate disputes. Who can speak truth without fear of execution. She paused. That's what the Silvermoon line used to do. What they died trying to preserve. And what needs to be restored if the territories are going to survive. Cassandra's expression had gone cold. So you're saying nothing fundamental changes. The Alpha King keeps his power, the packs remain subservient, and you, her lips curved into something cruel. You get to play at being important. How convenient for you. I'm saying the system needs reform, not revolution. Reina's voice hardened. I'm saying that power shared is power strengthened. That wolves do better when they have both strong leadership and strong accountability. That the goddess wants balance, not the pendulum swinging from one extreme to another. And if I disagree? Cassandra's voice was soft, dangerous. If I believe the prophecy demands more than half measures and political compromise? What then? Reina felt power stir beneath her skin, not the full flood that had consumed Theron, but enough to make her point. Silver fire flickered across her hands, and she saw Cassandra's eyes widen fractionally. Then you're welcome to take it up with the goddess yourself. Reina's voice was quiet, but it carried. Go to the temple ruins. Kneel at the altar. Speak the words of binding and see if she answers you the way she answered me. She let the fire grow brighter. But I don't think she will. Because you don't actually care about balance or justice or what's best for the territories. You care about being right. About having your preferred system vindicated. And the goddess, she smiled, and it was cold. The goddess doesn't reward ego. For a long moment, Cassandra just stared at her. Then, surprisingly, she laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You're more like your mother than I expected. The elder's voice had lost its edge, replaced by something that almost sounded like approval. She was stubborn too, convinced she knew the goddesses well better than anyone else. Got herself killed for it. Pain lanced through Reina's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. My mother died protecting people she loved from wolves who decided fear was more important than truth. If that's the legacy she left me, I'm honored to carry it. Cassandra studied her for another moment, then nodded once. Sharp, decisive. Very well. I'll support your interpretation of the prophecy. For now. She turned to address the crowd. The Silver Moon Priestess has spoken. The territories will reform, not revolt. The Alpha King system remains, but with proper oversight and accountability. Her eyes found Kellen. And you, Your Majesty, will work with her to implement these changes. Or the next elder who challenges you won't be as easily defeated as Theron. It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but Reina would take it. Cassandra was dangerous, manipulative and cunning, and far too willing to sacrifice pawns in pursuit of her goals. But she was also influential. If she supported the proposed reforms, others would follow. The crowd was murmuring again, but the tone had shifted. Less hostile, more cautiously optimistic. Like wolves who'd been trapped in a burning building finally seeing an exit that didn't require jumping from the roof. Reina turned to find Kellen watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pride, definitely. Relief. But also something that looked almost like awe. You just faced down an elder who's survived for over 400 years, he said quietly. And won. I didn't win. Reina moved back to him, suddenly desperate for his warmth again. Her skin felt cold despite the silver fire still flickering across her hands. I just convinced her that supporting me was more useful than opposing me. There's a difference. Still impressive. His arms came around her waist again, pulling her close, and she let herself lean into him. Let herself be held while the arena slowly emptied around them, wolves departing with more questions than answers, but at least willing to consider that maybe, there was a path forward that didn't end in blood and fire. Garrick approached one more time before leaving, his expression still heavy with shame. We'll convene the full council tomorrow. Begin discussing implementation of the reforms you outlined. He hesitated. And we'll start correcting the historical record. Make sure your people are remembered properly. It won't fix what was done, but his voice caught. It's a start. Reina nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. A start. Such a small word for something that felt monumentally important. For the first time in her life, her people's story would be told truthfully. Their sacrifice acknowledged. Their memory honored instead of erased. It wasn't justice. Not really. But it was something. After Garrick left, after the last of the crowd had filtered out and the arena fell silent except for the whisper of wind through ancient stone, Reina finally let herself break. The tears came hard and fast, 2 years of suppressed grief and rage and desperate loneliness finally breaking free. She buried her face in Kellen's chest and sobbed for her mother whose voice she could barely remember, for her father who'd died trying to protect a temple that burned anyway, for all the children who'd hidden in root cellars and farmhouse ruins and never found their way home, for the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become, and the impossible gulf between them. Kellen held her through it all. Didn't try to stop the tears or offer empty platitudes. Just held her, one hand stroking her hair, while she finally let herself grieve properly for the first time in 18 years. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her feelings scraped raw and strangely lighter, she pulled back enough to look up at him. His face was wet too, whether from her tears or his own, she couldn't tell. What happens now? Her voice came out hoarse. Kellen's smile was crooked, exhausted, but genuine. Now we go back to that hidden room I showed you. I clean and bandage these wounds there unopened before I bleed out. You sleep for approximately 16 hours while your body recovers from channeling enough divine power to level a small city. He brushed a strand of hair away from her face. And then tomorrow, we start figuring out how to rebuild a world that's been broken for 300 years. Is that all? She found herself smiling despite everything. Despite the exhaustion and the grief and the overwhelming weight of responsibility that had just been dropped on her shoulders. Is that all? He laughed, and it sounded almost giddy. We also need to officially declare your freedom, make sure every pack in the territories knows the curse is broken and you're under my protection. Figure out what title to give you so the council takes you seriously. Deal with the political fallout from Theron's death, because his pack won't be happy about losing their representative. Oh, and his expression softened. Court you properly. Like I promised. Flowers and formal declarations, and all the things you deserved to have from the beginning. Reina felt fresh tears threatening, but these were different. Warmer. You remember that? I remember everything you said last night. His forehead came to rest against hers. Including the promise you made. That if I survived, you'd let me court you the way you deserved. Well, he gestured at himself, bloodied and battered but alive. I survived. So now you're stuck with me. Stuck with you. She tested the words, found they didn't sound nearly as terrible as they should. The Alpha King who followed his maid into forbidden lands and discovered she was everything he should fear. The maid who turned out to be the last priestess of a murdered bloodline. His smile was soft. Who saved my life? Who fulfilled a prophecy? Who's going to help me build something better than what came before? He kissed her, gentle and reverent. Who I love more than I probably should, given we've known each other less than a week. 2 years, 3 months, and 23 days, Reina corrected. You've been watching me that whole time. Fair point. He kissed her again, less gentle this time. Still seems fast for overthrowing corrupt elders and restructuring territorial governance, though. She laughed, actually laughed, and it felt like magic. Like something impossible finally becoming possible. They stood there in the empty arena while dawn light crept across the blood-stained earth, holding each other and trying to memorize the moment. Because tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conflicts, new wolves who opposed change and would fight to maintain the status quo. Tomorrow would bring council meetings and political maneuvering and the slow, grinding work of reform. But today, right now, in this moment, they'd survived. Had won against impossible odds. Had chosen each other when choosing each other meant risking everything. And that had to be enough. Had to be worth celebrating, even if only for a few stolen hours before the world crashed back in and demanded they be more than just a maid and an alpha king who'd fallen in love. Before destiny called again, asking them to choose between power and each other. Though if Reina was being honest, she'd already made her choice. Power would come and go. Prophecies would be fulfilled or broken. Territories would rise and fall and rebuild themselves in new configurations. But love, the bond humming between them, growing stronger with every heartbeat, that was eternal. That was what the goddess had really wanted all along. Not the overthrow of systems or the redistribution of power, but the reminder that wolves were meant to run in packs, to choose their mates, to build families and communities based on loyalty and trust instead of fear and domination. Everything else was just details. 3 weeks later, Reina stood in front of a mirror she'd never thought she'd see herself in. The glass was ancient, framed in silver that had turned dark with age, and it hung in what had once been her mother's chamber. The room had been sealed for 23 years, locked away in the archives beneath the fortress, forgotten by everyone except Kellen, who'd found it while searching for evidence to break her curse. Now it was hers again. Restored, cleaned, the dust of decades swept away to reveal walls carved with lunar symbols and constellations mapped in silver inlay. A priestess's room. A place where the last of the Silver Moon line could remember who she was beneath the gray uniform and the bowed head. Except she wasn't wearing the uniform anymore. The woman in the mirror wore robes of deep midnight blue, threaded with silver that caught the light and made it look like she was wrapped in captured starlight. Her hair, no longer tangled and hidden, fell in waves past her shoulders, held back from her face by a circlet of black and silver etched with the crescent moon embracing a star. The silver moon crest. Her birthright reclaimed. She looked like a priestess. Like someone who could channel divine power and speak truth to corrupt elders and stand before an entire territory demanding they choose justice over convenience. She looked like her mother. The thought made her chest ache with a grief that had dulled but would never fully disappear. She'd been 5 years old the last time she'd seen her mother's face, but standing here in robes that might have been cut from the same cloth, wearing symbols her mother had worn, Reina felt the weight of that loss settle over her shoulders like a familiar cloak. "You look terrified." Reina turned to find Kellen leaning in the doorway, watching her with that expression he'd been wearing more and more lately, part pride, part wonder, part concern that she was taking on too much too fast. He was probably right to be concerned. In 3 weeks, they'd restructured the council, abolished the curse laws, begun training the first candidates for the restored priestess order, and weathered no fewer than 7 formal challenges from alphas who thought Kellen had gone soft by letting a silver moon live. He'd won 4 of those challenges personally, delegated 2 to champions he trusted, and talked down 1 alpha who'd been willing to listen to reason. It had been exhausting, exhilarating, absolutely terrifying. And tonight was the formal ceremony where Reina would be officially recognized as the High Priestess of the Silver Moon Order, a title that hadn't existed for 300 years. Brought back from extinction by wolves who were desperately trying to rebuild something better from the ashes of what had been burned. "I am terrified," she admitted, turning back to the mirror. "What if I get it wrong? What if I say the wrong thing, or the ceremony falls apart, or—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "What if I'm not enough? Not priest enough, not strong enough, not wise enough to be what everyone needs me to be?" Kellen moved into the room, his footsteps quiet on the stone floor. He came to stand behind her, and their reflections stared back at them from the ancient glass, the Alpha King and his priestess, the Maid and the man who'd followed her into forbidden lands and discovered she was his destiny. "You're already enough." His hands settled on her shoulders, warm and solid and grounding. "You survived genocide. Lived alone for years when you should have died. Accepted a curse and endured 6 years of servitude without breaking. Exposed corruption that had been festering for centuries. Fulfilled a prophecy and defeated an elder who'd survived for 300 years. He met her eyes in the mirror. "You're more than enough, Reina. You always have been." "Then why am I shaking?" "Because you're about to step into a role that comes with impossible expectations and 0 room for error." His voice was gentle. "Because dozens of wolves are going to be watching you tonight, judging whether you're worthy of the power you've been given. Because you care deeply about doing this right, and caring makes you vulnerable." He squeezed her shoulders. "But you're not doing it alone. Remember that." She wanted to believe him. Wanted to let his certainty wash away the fear that had been building in her chest all day. But the truth was, she felt desperately unprepared for what was coming. Being a priestess wasn't like being a servant. Servants just had to keep their heads down and their work clean and their presence forgettable. Priestesses had to stand tall, speak clearly, make decisions that affected entire packs. Had to mediate disputes and interpret divine will and somehow convince wolves who'd been taught to fear power like hers that it could be used for something other than destruction. Had to be perfect, because anything less would confirm what half the territory still believed, that Silvermoon magic was dangerous, that her bloodline should have stayed extinct, that Kellen had made a terrible mistake by letting her live. What if they're right? The question slipped out before she could stop it. What if I am too dangerous? What if my power— she gestured at the silver fire that flickered across her hands whenever her emotions ran high. What if it hurts someone? What if I lose control and— You won't. Kellen turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face. You've had that power for 3 weeks now, and you haven't hurt anyone except Theron, who absolutely deserved it. You've been careful, controlled, using it only when necessary. That's not going to change just because you're wearing different robes. But what if it does? Her voice came out small, childlike. What if the ceremony triggers something, or someone attacks and I react wrong, or— Then we'll deal with it. His thumbs brushed along her cheekbones. Together. Because that's what mates do, face the impossible together and figure out solutions even when there don't seem to be any. Mates. The word still made her stomach flip. They'd been officially bonded for 2 weeks now, a private ceremony with just the two of them, and an elder who'd been willing to officiate despite the political complications. Nothing public yet, because the council had argued they needed time to prepare the packs, to manage expectations, to make sure no one tried to assassinate the Alpha King for choosing a Silvermoon as his mate. But it was real. The bond thrumming between them was stronger now, fully formed, a connection that let her feel his emotions as clearly as her own. Right now, she felt his absolute conviction that she could handle tonight. His faith in her, bone deep and unshakable. It helped. Not enough to banish the fear entirely, but enough to make it manageable. Okay. She took a breath, then another. Okay. I can do this. You can do this, he echoed. Then he smiled, crooked and warm. And afterward, when you're officially High Priestess and the entire territory has witnessed your power and wisdom, we're going to sneak away to that hidden room, and I'm going to spend several hours reminding you that you're not just a symbol or a prophecy or a political tool. You're Reina, the girl who dances with me in firelight and falls asleep mid-sentence when she's exhausted and steals extra bread from dinner to feed stray cats. Despite everything, she felt herself smile. That sounds perfect. Good. He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. Now let's go show the territories what a real priestess looks like. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall, because the temple ruins were still too damaged to safely host a crowd. Kellen had promised they'd rebuild it eventually, restore the altar, clear the vines, make it once again a place where wolves could come to pray and priestesses could commune with the goddess. But that was a project for the future, when things had stabilized and the territories weren't constantly teetering on the edge of civil war. For tonight, the Great Hall would have to do. It had been transformed. The usual banners, crimson and gold, the Alpha King's colors, had been joined by others. Midnight blue and silver, the Silvermoon colors that hadn't been displayed publicly in 300 years. The effect was striking, almost overwhelming. A visual declaration that things were changing, that the old order was making room for something new. Or trying to, at least. The hall was packed. Representatives from every major pack in the territories had come to witness the ceremony, some out of genuine curiosity, some because they'd been politically obligated to attend, some because they wanted to see the Silvermoon heir with their own eyes and judge whether she was threat or savior. Reina could feel their stares as she processed down the central aisle, Kellen at her side. Could sense their emotions, suspicion, curiosity, fear, hope, all tangled together in a not-so-complex, she couldn't parse individual threads. Her hands wanted to shake. She forced them still. The dais at the front of the hall had been set up with 2 thrones, one for the Alpha King, one for the High Priestess. Equal seats, equal authority. A physical representation of the balance they were trying to restore. Assuming she didn't mess this up spectacularly. They reached the dais and Kellen squeezed her hand once before moving to his throne. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but it steadied her. Reminded her that she wasn't alone in this. That whatever happened, they'd face it together. Garrick stepped forward to serve as officiant. He'd volunteered for the role despite his complicated history with Reina, or maybe because of it. A way of publicly demonstrating that he supported the changes, that he'd moved past the lies Theron had fed them all. "We gather tonight," he began, his voice carrying through the hall, "to witness the restoration of an ancient order. The Silver Moon priestesses served these territories for over 1,000 years, keeping records, mediating disputes, interpreting the will of the goddess who watches over all wolves." He paused. 300 years ago, that order was destroyed. Tonight, it begins again. He turned to Reina, and she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like apology. For the part his predecessors had played in the massacre. For the lies they'd all believed. For the fact that she was 20 years old and being asked to resurrect an entire religious tradition with no training and no support beyond what she could piece together from ancient texts. Reina of the Silver Moon line. His voice was formal now, ritualistic. Last daughter of a murdered bloodline. Survivor of persecution. Fulfiller of prophecy. Do you accept the role of High Priestess? Do you swear to serve the goddess above all political interests? To speak truth even when truth is inconvenient? To be the conscience of the territories when conscience is desperately needed? The words hung in the air, heavy with expectation. This was it. The moment where she either stepped fully into the role she'd been born for, or admitted she wasn't strong enough to carry it. Except that wasn't really a choice, was it? Not when the territories were still fracturing, still tearing themselves apart because they'd lost the balance that kept wolves from devouring each other. Not when she was the only person alive who remembered the old prayers, who could channel the goddess's power, who could stand before corrupt alphas and burn away their lies with silver fire. She was the last. Which meant she was the only. Which meant this wasn't a choice at all. "I accept." Her voice came out stronger than she'd expected. Clear. Certain. "I swear to serve the goddess and the territories. To keep records. To mediate disputes. To speak truth to power, no matter the cost. To be what my ancestors were, balance in a world that's forgotten how to stand steady." Garrick nodded, then produced a small wooden box from his robes. Inside was a pendant, not the cursed one that had bound her to servitude, but a new one. Silver worked into the shape of a crescent moon embracing a star, hanging from a chain that looked like it had been woven from moonlight itself. "Then by the authority vested in me by the Council and the Alpha King, I name you High Priestess of the Silver Moon Order." He lifted the pendant, holding it up so the entire hall could see. "May your service bring wisdom to the foolish, justice to the oppressed, and balance to territories that have been tilted too long toward power without accountability." He placed the pendant around her neck, and the moment the metal touched her skin, Reina felt something shift. Power flooded through her, not the wild, barely controlled surge she'd felt in the arena when exposing Theron, but something steadier, deeper, like a wellspring that had been waiting for her to finally claim it, that had been gathering strength beneath the surface for 23 years just for this moment. The silver fire erupted from her skin, but gently this time. Softly. It spread across her robes like luminescence, making her glow with the cold light of the moon itself. The hall gasped, but she barely heard them. Was too focused on the sensation of the goddess's attention settling over her like a hand on her shoulder. "Welcome, daughter." The voice resonated through her bones, through the ancient stone of the fortress, through every wolf-blooded creature in the hall. "You are seen. You are known. You are accepted." Tears blurred Reina's vision. She'd expected the ceremony to be political theater, necessary, but ultimately symbolic. She hadn't expected to actually feel the goddess's presence. Hadn't expected divine acknowledgement that yes, she was worthy, she was enough, she was exactly what the territories needed even if she didn't feel remotely qualified. The light faded slowly, settling back beneath her skin like a tide going out. When her vision cleared, she found the entire hall on their feet, some bowing, some simply staring in awe. Even the wolves who'd come skeptical, who'd been convinced this was all political maneuvering by an alpha king infatuated with a dangerous girl, looked shaken. Because they'd all felt it, that moment when divinity brushed against mortality and left its mark. Reina turned to find Kellen watching her with an expression that made her chest tight. Pride, yes, but also something that looked almost like reverence. Like he was seeing her fully for the first time, understanding the magnitude of what she'd just become. Not just his mate. Not just a survivor. But a priestess recognized by the goddess herself, given authority that transcended any crown or council vote. She took the seat beside him, not behind him, not beneath him, but beside him, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the hall. The Alpha King and his priestess. Power and accountability. Strength and wisdom. Balance finally restored. The celebration afterward was both better and worse than Reina had anticipated. Better because several alphas who'd been openly hostile to her appointment approached to offer grudging respect. Because wolves who'd lost family members in the original massacre thanked her through tears for making sure their ancestors' stories would finally be told truthfully. Because children stared at her with wide eyes full of wonder, like she was something from a fairy tale come to life. Worse because she could feel the undercurrent of resistance still present in the hall. The wolves who smiled to her face, but radiated suspicion. The council members who'd voted for the reforms only because refusing would have been political suicide, but who clearly believed this was all a terrible mistake waiting to collapse. The ones who looked at her and saw threat instead of hope. She was talking to a young alpha from the Eastern Territories, explaining how the priestess training program would work, who could apply, what the selection criteria would be when she felt it. A spike of malice so sharp it made her stumble mid-sentence. Someone in this hall wanted her dead. Wanted her gone with an intensity that bordered on murderous rage. And they were close. Somewhere in the crowd, hidden among the well-wishers and the curious and the politically obligated. Watching. Waiting. Reina's hand moved instinctively to the pendant at her throat, and she felt power stir beneath her skin. Ready. Prepared to defend if necessary. But nothing happened. No attack came. Whoever was radiating that hatred was keeping it carefully hidden, biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Or maybe just silently seething, impotent and furious, but unwilling to act on it. She couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty made her skin crawl. Kellen appeared at her elbow a moment later, his hand settling on the small of her back in a gesture that looked casual, but was anything but. Everything all right? Someone here wants to kill me. She kept her voice low, her expression neutral. No need to cause a panic. I can feel it. But I don't know who. His jaw tightened fractionally. How certain are you? Very. The malice was still there, a poisonous presence at the edge of her awareness. But they're not acting on it. Not yet. Then we'll be careful. His hand pressed more firmly against her back. Stick close to me for the rest of the night. We'll increase security, have guards patrol more frequently, make sure you're never alone in public spaces. It wasn't ideal. She hated the thought of needing protection, of proving the skeptics right that her power made her a target, but she nodded. Survival meant adaptation. Meant accepting help when help was necessary, even when pride screamed that she should be able to handle threats herself. The celebration continued, but Reina's enjoyment was tainted now. She smiled and talked and accepted congratulations while part of her mind was constantly scanning the crowd, trying to identify the source of that murderous intent. Trying to figure out who wanted her dead badly enough to radiate hatred in a room full of witnesses. It could have been anyone. A wolf who'd lost family in the border disputes Theron's corruption had exacerbated. Someone who genuinely believed the Silver Moon line was cursed and dangerous. A political rival of Kellen's who saw her as a weakness to exploit. An elder who resented having their authority checked by a 20-year-old girl with divine backing. The possibilities were endless, and that was the most terrifying part. Hours later, back in the hidden room that had become their sanctuary, Reina finally let herself collapse. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her ceremonial robes, and felt exhaustion crash over her like a physical wave. Her hands were shaking. Her head was pounding. And the memory of that spike of malice, so intense, so personal, wouldn't stop replaying in her mind. Kellen knelt in front of her, unlacing her boots with gentle efficiency. "Talk to me. I don't know if I can do this." The admission came out raw. Standing in front of everyone, pretending to be confident and wise and worthy of the title they just gave me, all while knowing that someone in that room wants me dead. She laughed, but it came out slightly unhinged. "This is insane. All of it. I'm 20 years old, Kellen. I spent 6 years scrubbing floors. I have no formal training, no real understanding of what a priestess is supposed to do beyond what I could piece together from ancient texts and half-remembered childhood lessons." Her voice cracked. "How am I supposed to be the conscience of the territories when I barely know how to be a functional adult?" Kellen finished with her boots and sat back on his heels, looking up at her with an expression that was equal parts gentle and fierce. "You're supposed to be exactly what you are, someone who survived impossible odds, who kept their humanity when bitterness would have been easier, who chose justice over vengeance even when vengeance was justified." He caught her hands, holding them steady. "You don't need formal training to be that, Reina. You just need to keep being you. What if me isn't enough?" "It is." His voice was absolute. "It already has been. You defeated Theron. Exposed corruption that had been festering for centuries. Convinced a hall full of skeptical wolves that maybe, change was possible. That's more than most people accomplish in a lifetime. But there's still so much to do." The words tumbled out in a rush. "We need to rebuild the temple. Train new priestesses. Rewrite the historical texts. Mediate the border disputes that are still escalating in the Eastern Territories. Figure out how to balance alpha authority with priestess oversight without constant power struggles. And all of that assumes no one assassinates me before we can implement any of it. Then we start small." Kellen moved to sit beside her on the bed, pulling her against his side. "One dispute at a time. One trainee at a time. One day at a time. We don't have to fix everything immediately, Reina. We just have to keep moving forward, keep choosing progress over perfection, keep believing that what we're building is worth the struggle." She wanted to believe him. Wanted to let his certainty wash away the fear and doubt and bone-deep exhaustion. But the spike of malice was still echoing in her memory, a reminder that not everyone wanted progress. That some wolves would fight the changes with everything they had, because change meant admitting their predecessors were wrong, and that admission carried costs too high to pay. What if we're wrong? The question came out small. What if the territories can't handle balance? What if trying to restore the old ways just creates new problems, new conflicts, new opportunities for corruption? Then we'll adapt. Kellen's voice was steady. We'll learn from our mistakes and adjust course and keep trying until we get it right. That's what leadership is, not having all the answers, but being willing to keep searching for them even when the search is hard. Reina leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling some of the tension drain from her body. He was right. She knew he was right. Perfection wasn't the goal, progress was. And they'd already made more progress in 3 weeks than anyone had thought possible. But knowing that intellectually didn't make the fear go away. Didn't erase the memory of that malicious presence at the celebration, or the certainty that someone was planning something terrible, just waiting for the right moment to strike. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Not just for me. For you. For everything we're trying to build. What if it all falls apart? What if I make a wrong choice and people die because of it? Then you'll grieve and learn and try to do better next time." His arm tightened around her shoulders. "That's all any of us can do, Reina. Make the best choices we can with the information we have, accept that sometimes we'll be wrong, and keep moving forward anyway. He kissed the top of her head. You're not alone in this. You have me. You have Garrick and the council members who are genuinely trying to help. You have the young wolves who are already applying for priestess training because they believe in what you're building. You have allies, even if it doesn't always feel like it. She wanted to believe that. Wanted to focus on the support instead of the resistance, on the hope instead of the fear. But alone in the quiet of their hidden room, with exhaustion making her defenses thin, all she could think about was how easily it could all come crashing down. One assassination. One successful challenge to Kellen's authority. One priestess trainee who turned out to be a spy for wolves who wanted the old corruption back. So many ways this could fail. So many opportunities for disaster. And she was supposed to hold it all together with divine power she barely understood and wisdom she didn't feel remotely qualified to possess. Kellen. Her voice was barely a whisper. Promise me something. Anything. If I fail, if this all collapses and the territories descend into chaos and it's my fault, promise me you won't blame yourself. Promise me you'll remember that we tried. That we chose hope over fear and justice over convenience, even when the easier path would have been to maintain the status quo. She pulled back enough to look at his face. Promise me that even if I'm not enough, you'll remember that I tried to be. His expression cracked, revealing the fear he'd been hiding beneath his steady confidence. You're not going to fail. But if I do, you won't. He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Because you're stronger than you think. Because you have help. Because the goddess herself recognized you tonight, and that means something. But his voice softened. If the impossible happens, if everything falls apart despite our best efforts, then yes. I promise I'll remember. I'll remember that you were brave when bravery was hard. That you chose justice when justice was dangerous. That you loved me even when loving me complicated everything. He kissed her, soft and desperate. But you're not going to fail, Reina. I won't let you. She kissed him back, pouring all her fear and hope and desperate love into it. And for a moment, in the safety of his arms, she let herself believe. Believe that maybe they could pull this off. That maybe balance could be restored, corruption rooted out, the territories healed from centuries of accumulated damage. That maybe a Maid and an Alpha King who'd fallen in love against all odds could actually build something worth having from the ruins of what had been burned. Maybe. Or maybe they were doomed to fail and future generations would tell stories about the last Silvermoon priestess who'd tried to restore balance and been destroyed by forces too powerful to overcome. She didn't know which. Couldn't know, not yet. All she could do was keep trying. Keep choosing hope. Keep believing that the goddess had recognized her for a reason, and that reason was bigger than her fear or doubt or the very real possibility that someone in the territories wanted her dead. All she could do was trust. In Kellen, in the allies they'd gathered, in the divine power thrumming beneath her skin. In the possibility that love and justice and hard-fought hope might actually be enough. Even when it felt like they weren't. So here we are. At the end of Reina's beginning. The girl who scrubbed blood from stone floors and kept her head down and her scent hidden. The last daughter of a murdered bloodline. The priestess who rose from servitude to stand before the territories and demand they choose justice over fear. She's not perfect. She's scared and exhausted and wrestling with doubts that would drown a weaker person. But she's still standing. Still fighting. Still believing that maybe, just maybe, the world can be better than it's been. And Kellen, the Alpha King who followed his maid into forbidden lands and discovered she was his destiny. Who chose her over his crown, justice over political convenience, love over every practical reason to walk away. He's not perfect either. He's made mistakes, inherited a corrupt system, carries the weight of his grandfather's sins. But he's trying to be better, to build something worth having, to prove that strength doesn't have to mean cruelty and power doesn't have to corrupt. Together, they're reshaping a world that's been broken for 300 years. and someone wants them dead for it. So I'll leave you with this question, the one that matters most. Would you have chosen her side? When the comfortable lies were stripped away and uncomfortable truths took their place, when the servant turned out to be a priestess and the enemy turned out to be a victim, and the entire foundation you'd built your life on cracked and revealed rot beneath, would you have had the courage to admit you'd been wrong? Or would you have been the wolf radiating malice in that celebration hall, planning violence because change terrified you more than injustice ever did? It's easy to say you'd choose justice. Harder to actually do it when justice costs you everything. But that's what makes stories like this matter. They ask us who we'd be when tested. Force us to examine whether our principles hold when holding them requires sacrifice. Reina survived genocide and enslavement and 6 years of invisible servitude. She chose forgiveness when vengeance was justified. She chose hope when despair was easier. She chose to be better than the wolves who destroyed her people, even when being worse would have been understandable. And now she's building something beautiful from ashes, with an alpha king who loves her and a goddess who watches over her and enemies who want her gone before she can finish what she started. The question is, will she succeed? I don't know. This story isn't over. Reina's just getting started. But I know this, she'll keep fighting. Keep choosing hope. Keep believing that balance is possible, that wolves can be better than their worst instincts, that love and justice might actually be enough to heal centuries of damage. And maybe that belief is the real prophecy. Not the one written in ancient texts, but the one written in every choice she makes. Every time she stands when falling would be easier. Every time she chooses truth over lies, even when truth is dangerous. Maybe that's what the goddess saw in her all along. Not perfection. Just the stubborn, beautiful refusal to let fear win. If this story lit something inside you, if Reina's courage touched something deep, if Kellen's devotion made you believe in love that chooses justice, if you want to know what happens next when enemies strike and allies falter and two wolves try to hold a fracturing world together with nothing but hope and determination, then subscribe to Shayla's Romance Library. Because here, we tell tales that burn. Stories about women who refuse to stay invisible. About men who choose love over power. About the messy, complicated, absolutely devastating beauty of hope in the face of impossible odds. We tell stories that ask hard questions and don't always provide easy answers. That celebrate strength without glorifying violence. That remind us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe in better when better seems impossible. So if you're ready for more stories like Reina's, stories that will make you feel deeply, question bravely, and maybe see the world a little differently, hit that subscribe button. Because the next chapter is coming. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when the wolves who want the old ways back decide to make their move. When love and justice collide with fear and tradition. When Reina discovers that some prophecies demand more than sacrifice, they demand transformation. Subscribe to Shayla's Romance Library, where the wolves are fierce, the romance is real, and every story asks you to choose. Will you stand with those brave enough to demand better? Or will you be the malice hiding in the crowd? The choice, as always, is yours. Thank you for experiencing Reina and Kellen's story. If their journey moved you, consider sharing it with someone who needs to remember that hope is a choice we make every day, especially when choosing it costs us everything. Until the next tale burns. Shayla's Romance Library.